The gaslights had dimmed to copper embers along Marylebone Road, and the fog pressed against the window panes like something alive, something waiting. Inside the parlour at number 47, 6 figures sat in a perfect circle, their hands joined across a table draped in black velvet. The medium, a woman named Madame Estella Devereaux, had closed her eyes and begun to hum a low, trembling note that seemed to rise from somewhere deeper than her throat. The candles flickered, the temperature dropped, and then, from the darkness beyond the circle, came a voice that did not belong to anyone living. It spoke a name. A woman gasped. Another whimpered. The gentleman across from Madame Devereaux tightened his grip on the hands beside him, his knuckles white as bone. The voice came again, closer now, and with it the scent of earth and decay, as though something had crawled up from beneath the floorboards. Madame Devereaux's head tilted back, her mouth opening wide, and the voice poured forth, not her own, never her own. It spoke of secrets, of lies, of blood that had not yet been spilled but would be before the week was through. And when the séance ended, when the candles were relit and the circle broken, one chair sat empty. The woman who had gasped was gone. The door remained locked from the inside, and on the table in the centre of the black velvet lay a single white lily, its petals already beginning to rot. Chapter 1. The Spiritualist Fever. Good evening, and welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night has settled around you now, and the world beyond your window has grown quiet and small. Wherever you are listening from tonight, whatever hour the clock shows in your corner of the world, I invite you to let the present fade, to draw the curtains against the modern age, and to step backward with me, backward through time, through fog and gaslight, into the autumn of 1873, when London trembled with a fever that had nothing to do with disease and everything to do with the desperate human need to speak once more with the dead. Before we begin our descent into that shadowed world, I ask only that you subscribe to this channel so that we might walk together through many more nights of history's darkest hours. And now, let us drift into the past. London in the autumn of 1873 wore its soot like a second skin. The city had grown vast and hungry, swallowing villages and farmland, spreading its brick and iron across the Thames Valley until nearly 4 million souls pressed together in a maze of streets that never fully saw the sun. The air tasted of coal smoke and river mud. The fog came early in those years, rolling up from the water in the afternoons, turning the gaslights into dim halos of copper and gold, muffling the clatter of horse hooves and the cries of street vendors, until the city seemed to exist in a perpetual twilight, neither day nor night, but something in between, a liminal space where the living and the dead might almost touch. It was into this twilight that the spiritualist movement had spread like a contagion of hope. It had begun across the Atlantic in the farmhouses of upstate New York, where 2 young sisters claimed to hear knocking sounds that answered questions, that spelled out messages from beyond the grave. The Fox Sisters, they were called, and their fame had crossed the ocean on the same ships that brought cotton and tobacco, arriving in Liverpool and spreading through the drawing rooms of England with a speed that surprised even those who trafficked in such mysteries. By 1873, spiritualism had become a fashionable obsession, particularly among the middle and upper classes, those with leisure enough to contemplate the afterlife and money enough to pay for the privilege of contact. The reasons for this fever were not difficult to understand. Death in Victorian London was not an abstraction. It lived in every house, in every family. Children died of scarlet fever and diphtheria. Women died in childbirth. Men died in factories and on the docks. Cholera swept through the poorer districts with seasonal regularity. Tuberculosis consumed the lungs of rich and poor alike. The average life expectancy hovered near 40 years. Grief was not occasional but constant, a companion that walked beside every person, waiting for its moment to strike, and when it struck, the survivors were left with questions that no priest or doctor could answer with certainty. Where had the beloved gone? Did consciousness survive the body's failure? Could the dead still see the living, still care, still speak, The spiritualists said yes. They said the veil between worlds was thin, that with the proper conditions and the proper intermediary, communication was possible. They held séances in parlors draped with heavy curtains to block the light. They gathered around tables, joined hands, sang hymns, and waited for the spirits to manifest. And manifest they did, or seemed to. Tables tilted and rapped out coded messages. Disembodied voices spoke from the darkness. Phantom hands touched the faces of the bereaved. Objects moved without visible cause. Trumpets floated through the air, playing melodies that the dead had loved in life. Some mediums went into trances and spoke in voices not their own, channeling entities they called spirit guides or the departed souls themselves. Others produced ectoplasm, a pale substance that emerged from their mouths or noses and took shapes that resembled human forms before dissolving back into nothing. The phenomenon was not without its critics. The scientific establishment, represented by men of the Royal Society and various philosophical institutions, regarded spiritualism with suspicion at best and contempt at worst. They demanded empirical evidence, controlled conditions, and reproducible results. Some investigators attended séances with the express purpose of exposing fraud, and fraud they often found. Mediums caught with concealed apparatus, accomplices hidden behind false walls, tricks borrowed from stage magicians to create the illusion of supernatural occurrence. The Times published editorials warning readers against charlatans who preyed upon grief. The medical journals diagnosed spiritualist belief as a form of hysteria, particularly common among women whose nerves had been weakened by the emotional shock. But exposure of one fraud did not diminish the movement. For every medium unmasked, 3 more appeared to take their place, and not all phenomena could be easily explained away. Even skeptical observers sometimes witnessed events that troubled their rationalist assumptions. Objects moving when all participants' hands were visible, information conveyed that the medium could not possibly have known through natural means. Physical effects that seemed to defy the laws of mechanics and thermodynamics as currently understood. The philosopher William James would later call spiritualism worthy of serious investigation. The chemist William Crookes conducted experiments with mediums under controlled conditions and concluded that some force, whether spiritual or not, was genuinely at work. Even Queen Victoria herself, devastated by the death of Prince Albert in 1861, had consulted mediums in hope of reaching her beloved husband, though such consultations were never officially acknowledged. The séances took place in homes across the city, from the grand townhouses of Belgravia to the modest terraces of Islington. They followed a pattern that had become ritualized through repetition. The participants, usually numbering between 4 and 12, would gather in a room from which as much light as possible had been excluded. Heavy drapes covered the windows, the gaslights were turned down or extinguished entirely. Candles provided the only illumination, and these were often placed in coloured glass holders that cast red or blue shadows across the walls. The table around which they sat might be of any size, but it was typically covered with a cloth, black velvet was preferred, and sometimes marked with symbols meant to attract benevolent spirits and repel malevolent ones. A Bible might be present. Flowers, particularly lilies, were often placed at the centre. The medium, almost always a woman, would take her place at the table. She might be a professional who charged fees for her services, or an amateur who conducted sitting out of genuine belief in her gift. She would explain the rules to the assembled participants. They must join hands and maintain the circle unbroken. They must not speak unless spoken to. They must approach the experience with open hearts and sincere desire for communication. Skepticism, she would warn, could drive the spirits away, or worse, invite darker entities to take their place. The participants would then join hands, and the medium would offer a prayer or invocation, calling upon the spirits to make themselves known, to bridge the gap between the earthly realm and whatever lay beyond. What followed varied from sitting to sitting, but certain phenomena recurred with frequency. Knocking sounds would be heard, seemingly emanating from the table itself or from the walls or floor. These knocks could be interpreted as a code, 1 knock for yes, 2 for no, or more elaborate systems spelling out letters and words. The table might begin to tilt or vibrate, sometimes violently enough to require strength to hold it down. Cold drafts would move through the sealed room. The temperature would drop precipitously, causing breath to mist and skin to prickle with chill that had nothing to do with winter. The medium might go into trance, her body becoming rigid or slack, her voice changing in pitch and timbre as another consciousness apparently took possession of her vocal apparatus. This voice would claim to be a spirit guide, or the departed soul of someone known to one of the sitters, and would deliver messages, answer questions, or simply make its presence felt before withdrawing back into whatever realm from which it had emerged. The believers left these séances transformed. They had heard their dead speak. They had felt their touch. They had received confirmation that death was not annihilation but transition, that love persisted beyond the grave, that they would be reunited with those they had lost when their own time came. The comfort this provided was immeasurable. It dried tears, it restored hope, it gave meaning to suffering and purpose to continued living. For the price of a few shillings or a guinea, depending on the medium's reputation, one could purchase peace of mind that the church offered only as promise and doctrine, while the spiritualists offered it as lived experience, as tangible evidence that could be witnessed with one's own senses. But not everyone who attended a séance left comforted. Some left disturbed. The darkness itself could be oppressive, the atmosphere heavy with expectation and fear. The phenomena, when they occurred, were not always benign. Voices sometimes spoke threats or accusations. Objects thrown by invisible hands could strike the sitters. The entities that manifested did not always claim to be the beloved dead, but rather identified themselves as strangers, as beings from other planes of existence, as things that had never been human and did not wish the living well. And occasionally, very occasionally, something would happen at a séance that transcended both belief and skepticism, that left all participants shaken regardless of their prior convictions, an event so strange, so inexplicable, that it would be spoken of in whispers for years afterward. London, in the autumn of 1873, was full of such whispers. They moved through the tea rooms and stoking parlours, through the markets and omnibus queues, carried by servants and shopkeepers and society ladies alike. Stories of extraordinary manifestations, of spirits that knew secrets no one living could know, of predictions that came true with unsettling accuracy. And in the fashionable districts north of Oxford Street, in the elegant crescents and squares of Marylebone and Fitzrovia, one name was spoken more than any other when the subject of spiritualism arose. Madame Estella Devereaux, a woman who had arrived from Paris only months before, who conducted séances in a style unlike anything London had yet witnessed, whose reputation for genuine contact with the other world had spread with such speed that invitations to her sittings were coveted like tickets to the opera. She was said to be beautiful. She was said to be terrifying. She was said to possess a gift that went beyond mere showmanship, beyond trickery, into realms that perhaps should not be explored by mortal minds. The autumn deepened. The fog grew thicker. The gaslights burned later into the evenings, and in the parlours of Marylebone, in rooms sealed against the light and the rational world beyond, circles formed around tables draped in black velvet, and hands joined, and candles flickered, and the breathing of the sitters slowed and synchronized until the room itself seemed to pulse with a single heartbeat, waiting for whatever would come when the barrier between living and dead grew thin enough to cross. The city did not know, could not know, that something else was waiting in that darkness, something that had learned to use the séance as a hunter uses a blind, concealing itself in the very phenomena that the believers expected, that the skeptics dismissed, moving through the shadows while eyes were closed and hands were held and minds were open to any voice that claimed to speak from beyond. It was waiting, and soon it would begin to feed. Chapter 2. Madame Devereaux. She arrived in London on a Tuesday morning in late August, when the heat lay thick over the city and the Thames smelled of low tide and sewage. The boat train from Dover pulled into Victoria Station at 10:30, and among the disembarking passengers was a woman who drew eyes without seeming to seek them. She was perhaps 30 years of age, though the estimation varied depending on the light and the angle from which one observed her. Her hair was dark, almost black, dressed in the elaborate style favoured on the continent, with curls that framed a face of striking pallor. Her eyes were her most remarkable feature, a shade of violet so deep they appeared almost purple in certain illuminations, ringed with lashes that needed no cosmetic enhancement. She wore mourning dress, black silk that rustled with her movements, and a veil of fine Chantilly lace that she kept lowered until she had passed through the station and into the street beyond. She gave her name to the porter as Madame Estella Devereaux, and she spoke English with an accent that suggested French birth and education, though there was something else beneath it, something that hinted at origins further east, in the Austrian territories perhaps, or beyond. She requested that her trunk and 2 cases be delivered to an address in Marylebone, to lodgings that had apparently been secured before her arrival through correspondence. She carried with her only a small valise and a leather satchel that she would not entrust to the porter, keeping it close to her person as she stepped into the hansom cab that would convey her north through the city. The rooms she had taken were on the 2nd floor of a respectable house on Welbeck Street, a quiet address convenient to Regent's Park and within walking distance of the British Museum. The landlady, a Mrs. Pemberton, was a widow of modest means who supplemented her income by letting furnished apartments to gentlewomen of good character and reliable payment. She had been initially reluctant when the correspondence had arrived from Paris, but the references provided had been impeccable, and the deposit sent in advance had been generous. When Madame Devereaux arrived in person, Mrs. Pemberton found herself strangely unable to voice any of the reservations she had mentally prepared. The woman was courteous, soft-spoken, and carried herself with a dignity that suggested breeding despite the absence of any accompanying family or servant. Mrs. Pemberton showed her to the rooms, explained the household arrangements, and withdrew with the curious sensation that she had somehow been dismissed from her own property. Madame Devereaux settled into her lodgings with minimal disruption to the household routine. She rose late, took her breakfast in her rooms, and spent her afternoons walking in the park or visiting the museum, where she was seen examining the Egyptian antiquities with particular interest. She received no visitors during her first fortnight in London. She sent and received correspondence through the post, but the letters bore foreign postmarks and revealed nothing of her purpose in England. Mrs. Pemberton, who was not above a certain curiosity regarding her tenants, learned almost nothing about the woman beyond the facts of her punctual rent payment and her quiet habits. The other lodgers, retired schoolmaster and 2 unmarried sisters who worked as governesses, reported that Madame Devereaux was polite when encountered on the stairs, but did not encourage conversation. It was not until the middle of September that the nature of Madame Devereaux's occupation became apparent, and even then it emerged through channels that Mrs. Pemberton only discovered after the fact. A lady of society, a Mrs. Arabella Wickham, whose husband held a position in the Foreign Office, had been introduced to Madame Devereaux through a mutual acquaintance in Paris. This acquaintance, a countess whose salon was famous for attracting artists and mystics, had written to Mrs. Wickham describing a séance conducted by Madame Devereaux that had convinced even the most hardened skeptics of genuine spiritual contact. The countess had provided Madame Devereaux's London address, and Mrs. Wickham, who had lost her only son to typhoid fever 3 years prior and had consulted numerous mediums in search of comfort, wrote requesting a private sitting. The séance took place in Mrs. Wickham's drawing room in Grosvenor Square on a Thursday evening. 6 persons attended: Mrs. Wickham herself, her sister, 2 close friends who shared her interest in spiritualism, and a gentleman from the Society for Psychical Research who had come to observe with scientific detachment. Madame Devereaux arrived precisely at the appointed hour, carrying her leather satchel and wearing the same black silk and lace that seemed to be her constant attire. She accepted no refreshment before the sitting commenced, explaining that food and drink could interfere with the delicate processes required for spirit communication. She examined the drawing room carefully, requested that certain pieces of furniture be moved to create more space around the table, and insisted that all mirrors be covered with dark cloth. When asked why, she explained that mirrors could trap spirits or allow malevolent entities to pass between worlds. The request was honoured. The sitting began at 8 o'clock. The gaslights were extinguished, leaving only 3 candles burning in ruby glass holders at the centre of the table. The 7 participants joined hands. Madame Devereaux offered no prayer or invocation, but instead fell silent, her breathing becoming slow and rhythmic, her head tilting back until her face was angled toward the ceiling. The silence stretched. The candle flames burned without wavering, and then, without any apparent transition, the temperature in the room plummeted. Breath became visible in the candlelight. Mrs. Wickham's sister gasped but maintained her grip on the hands beside her. The gentleman from the Society for Psychical Research later wrote that he felt as though he had been plunged into winter, though the window showed the warm September night beyond. The voice that emerged from Madame Devereaux's throat was not her own. It was higher in pitch, younger, with an accent that suggested the educated classes. It spoke a single word, a name, Thomas. Mrs. Wickham made a sound that was half sob, half prayer. Thomas had been her son's name, the child who had died at age 7. The voice continued, speaking in phrases that suggested a child's manner of expression, referring to memories that only Mrs. Wickham and her late son could have shared. A toy soldier he had treasured, a game they had played in the garden, the last words he had spoken before the fever took him. Mrs. Wickham wept openly, asking questions, receiving answers that satisfied her completely. The voice spoke for perhaps 10 minutes before growing fainter, as though receding into distance, and finally fading into silence. But the séance did not end there. As Mrs. Wickham sat trembling with emotion, another voice manifested, deeper and older, identifying itself as a spirit guide who had assisted in bringing the child's soul forward. This entity spoke of the conditions in the spirit realm, of the happiness that awaited the faithful, of the importance of continuing to live with purpose and love so that reunion would be possible when Mrs. Wickham's own time came. And then the guide spoke directly to the gentleman from the Society for Psychical Research, addressing him by name though Madame Devereaux had never been introduced to him, and revealing a fact about his own family history that he had never shared with any of the others present. The suicide of his elder brother 15 years prior, and the guilt he still carried for not recognizing the signs of his brother's despair. The gentleman sat rigid in his chair, his face drained of colour, unable to respond. The séance concluded shortly thereafter. Madame Devereaux emerged from her trance state gradually, like a swimmer surfacing from deep water. She appeared exhausted, her face even paler than usual, and she accepted a glass of water with a trembling hand. She remembered nothing of what had been said during the sitting, or claimed to remember nothing, which was typical of trance mediums. Mrs. Wickham embraced her with gratitude that bordered on worship, pressing payment into her hands that exceeded the agreed-upon fee by a substantial margin. The gentleman from the Society for Psychical Research left without speaking further, his scientific detachment apparently shaken by the personal revelation he'd received. Word of the séance spread through society with the speed that only genuine sensation can achieve. Within a week, Madame Devereaux received more than 30 requests for sittings. She declined most of them, explaining through carefully worded correspondence that her gift required rest and recovery between manifestations, that she could not conduct more than 2 or 3 séances per week without risking her own health and the quality of the contact achieved. This selectivity only increased her desirability. Invitations to private sittings became marks of social distinction. Ladies who secured appointments spoke of them with the same pride they brought to presentations at court or invitations to Marlborough House. The séances conducted by Madame Devereaux followed a pattern but never felt repetitious. She insisted always on complete darkness or near darkness, on absolute silence before the spirits manifested, on the unbroken circle of joined hands. But what occurred within those conditions varied dramatically. Sometimes the spirits spoke through her in trance. Sometimes disembodied voices emerged from corners of the room, speaking without any visible source. Objects moved, small items like rings or handkerchiefs that belonged to the deceased, seemingly transported from wherever the sitters had placed them and deposited in the centre of the table. Phantom touches were common, invisible hands brushing faces or grasping shoulders. The scent of flowers or perfumes associated with the dead would suddenly fill the room, and on several occasions, witnesses reported seeing luminous shapes, vaguely human in form, drifting through the darkness like pale smoke before dissipating. What distinguished Madame Devereaux from other mediums was not the variety of phenomena, but their specificity. The spirits that spoke through her or manifested in her presence conveyed information that seemed impossible to obtain through normal means. They knew pet names used only within families. They recalled incidents from childhood that no public record would contain. They made references to objects hidden away in attics or given to servants, to promises made on deathbeds, to secrets that the living had assumed died with the departed. Skeptics who attended expecting to expose fraud found themselves confronted with evidence that resisted easy explanation. The gentleman from the Society for Psychical Research published an account of his experience that stopped short of endorsing spiritualism, but admitted that certain phenomena remained scientifically inexplicable given current understanding. Mrs. Pemberton learned of her tenant's activities through neighbourhood gossip and was at first alarmed. Séances suggested disreputable behaviour, theatrical fraud, the sort of activity that might bring the wrong sort of attention to a respectable lodging house. She considered requesting that Madame Devereaux find accommodation elsewhere. But before she could broach the subject, she received a visitor, a countess with a carriage bearing a coat of arms, who had come personally to thank Mrs. Pemberton for providing rooms to such a remarkable woman, and to express the hope that Madame Devereaux would not be disturbed in her important work. The Countess left a generous gift for the household staff and a card inviting Mrs. Pemberton to call should she ever need assistance with any matter whatsoever. Mrs. Pemberton reconsidered her position. By late October, Madame Devereaux had become the most sought-after medium in London. Her name appeared in private diaries and letters, whispered in drawing rooms, mentioned with reverence by believers and with uncomfortable fascination by skeptics. She conducted her séances in the homes of her clients, never in her own lodgings, maintaining the privacy and respectability that her position demanded. She accepted payment but never solicited it, leaving the amount to the discretion of those who engaged her services. She formed no friendships with her clients, maintaining a distant courtesy that preserved the mysterious quality essential to her reputation. No one knew where she had come from beyond the vague reference to Paris. No one knew if Devereaux was her married name or maiden name, if she was truly a widow or simply adopted mourning dress for professional purposes. No one knew how she had acquired her gift or what price she paid for its exercise. She walked through Regent's Park on autumn afternoons, alone always, her black dress and veil making her a moving shadow among the falling leaves. Children playing with hoops would stop and stare as she passed. Nursemaids would cross themselves or touch iron railings for protection against the evil eye. She seemed not to notice or not to care. She would walk for hours, tracing the same paths repeatedly, pausing sometimes to stand beneath the trees and tilt her face upward, as though listening to voices only she could hear. Once, a bold young journalist approached her seeking an interview for his newspaper. She regarded him with those violet eyes and spoke a single sentence before walking away. She told him the name of his stillborn sister, the child his mother had lost before he was born, the child whose existence his parents had never revealed to him. He published no interview. He stopped attending church. He began drinking heavily and was dismissed from his position before Christmas. The autumn deepened into November. The fog came more frequently, thicker, turning daylight into murky twilight. The séances continued week after week in the grand houses of Mayfair and Belgravia, in the comfortable homes of the professional classes in Kensington and Bloomsbury. Madame Devereaux went where she was called, brought the dead to speak, and departed leaving comfort in her wake, or so it seemed. The believers multiplied, the skeptics grew quieter, and in the leather satchel she carried to every sitting, wrapped in black silk that no one was permitted to see, were objects whose purpose even Madame Devereaux might have struggled to explain. A mirror of antique silver, cracked across its surface, a bundle of dried herbs bound with hair, a small vial of liquid that gleamed like mercury, and a book with pages written in a language that predated Latin, that spoke of rituals older than Christianity, of ways to pierce the veil that were never meant to be known by mortal minds. She was successful. She was famous within the circles that mattered. She was wealthy enough to live comfortably for years on what she had already earned. And she was afraid, though she showed no sign of it, because the things that answered when she called were not always what the grieving expected, were not always even human, and they were growing stronger with each séance, pressing closer to the barrier between worlds. Hungry for something she could sense but not name, she dreamed at night of hands reaching up through floorboards, of voices calling her name in languages she did not speak, of a darkness that was not absence of light but presence of something else, something vast and cold and patient. She woke gasping, her sheets drenched with sweat, and she would light every candle in her rooms and sit awake until dawn, knowing that she should stop, that she should flee London and never conduct another séance, and knowing equally that she would not, could not, because the gift was also a curse, and the curse was also an addiction, and something had its hooks in her now, something that whispered promises of power and knowledge, and the final understanding that lay beyond death. November became December. The year turned toward its darkest days, and Madame Estella Devereaux continued her work, calling the dead forth in gaslit parlors, never knowing that someone else had begun to watch her séances with interest that had nothing to do with spirits or skepticism, someone who had learned to use the darkness and the belief and the fear to purposes that were entirely of this world, entirely human, and entirely monstrous. Chapter 3. The First Disappearance. Mrs. Catherine Helmsley was 43 years of age when she vanished from the locked parlour on the evening of December the 7th. She had been a widow for 2 years, her husband having succumbed to pneumonia during the brutal winter of 1871, leaving her comfortably provided for but profoundly alone. They had been childless, a sorrow that had marked their marriage despite its otherwise harmonious nature. She lived now in a townhouse in Wimpole Street, maintaining a small staff of 3 servants, and she occupied her days with charitable work and the society of other widowed ladies who formed a melancholy sisterhood of loss. She had attended her first séance in the spring following her husband's death, driven by loneliness and the hope that some fragment of connection might persist beyond the grave. That first experience had been disappointing. The medium, a stout woman who operated from rooms above a draper's shop in Clerkenwell, had produced nothing more convincing than vague platitudes and cold readings that could have applied to any bereaved widow. But Mrs. Guise, Helmsley's faith in the possibility of spirit communication had not been extinguished by one failure. She attended other sittings, gradually developing the ability to distinguish genuine phenomena from theatrical trickery, or so she believed. She had witnessed table tilting that seemed to defy physical explanation, had heard knocking sounds that appeared to come from within solid walls, had felt the temperature drop in sealed rooms, and experienced touches from invisible hands. Whether these phenomena represented genuine contact with the deceased or some other force, she could not say with certainty, but they had given her sufficient hope to continue her investigations. She had attended 3 séances conducted by Madame Devereaux during November, each time as part of a small group gathered in the home of a mutual acquaintance. On each occasion, the phenomena had been more dramatic than anything she had previously witnessed. During the second sitting, a voice claiming to be a husband had spoken, using his Christian name for her, a name he had employed only in private. During the third sitting, she had felt hands grasp her shoulders with such force that bruises appeared the following day. Though no living person had been behind her chair, she had been frightened, but also exhilarated, convinced that genuine contact had been achieved. When Madame Devereaux agreed to conduct a private sitting in Mrs. Helmsley's own home, she felt honoured beyond measure. The arrangements were made for Friday evening, the 7th of December. Mrs. Helmsley invited 5 other participants, 3 widowed friends from her charitable circle, a cousin visiting from Surrey, and a physician named Marcus Ashford who harboured scientific interest in spiritualist phenomena and had published several papers on the physiological effects of séance participation. The servants were given the evening free, sent to visit family or attend a music hall, so that the house would be quiet and undisturbed. Mrs. Helmsley prepared the drawing room herself, covering the windows with heavy velvet drapes, moving furniture to create space around the circular table that stood near the fireplace. She set out candles in coloured glass holders, arranged a vase of white lilies at the table's centre, and laid out the black cloth that Madame Devereaux had requested be provided. Madame Devereaux arrived at 7:30, her usual leather satchel in hand, her morning dress and veil rendering her a figure of elegant sombreness. She examined the room with care, requested that a mirror above the mantelpiece be turned to face the wall, and asked that the door be locked once all participants had entered, with the key placed upon the mantelpiece where all could see it. This last request was unusual, but Madame Devereaux explained that complete security was necessary to prevent any disturbance that might disrupt the delicate balance required for spirit manifestation. The other participants arrived within the following half hour, and by 8 o'clock all 7 were seated around the table, hands joined, the gaslights extinguished, only the candles providing illumination. The séance began with the now familiar pattern: silence, slowed breathing, the gradual cooling of the air. Madame Devereaux's head tilted back, her eyes closed, her face becoming mask-like. The candle flames began to waver despite the absence of any draught. Dr. Ashford, seated directly across from the medium, observed everything with careful attention, his physician's training making him alert to signs of deception or manipulation. He noticed that Madame Devereaux's hands remained in contact with those of her neighbours throughout, that her feet were visible beneath the table and motionless, that she exhibited physiological signs consistent with genuine trance state rather than theatrical pretense, the fixed pupils, the altered breathing pattern, the muscular rigidity. The first voice that manifested was female, elderly, claiming to be the deceased mother of one of the widowed friends. The communication was brief, affectionate and evidential, referring to details of family history that satisfied the recipient completely. The second voice was male, speaking in the rough accent of the labouring classes, addressing the cousin from Surrey and revealing itself to be her late father, a bricklayer who had died in a scaffolding accident when she was a child. The cousin wept quietly, asking questions, receiving answers that brought both comfort and renewed grief. And then came a longer silence, the temperature dropping further still, and a voice emerged that seemed to come not from Madame Devereaux, but from somewhere else in the room, from the darkness beyond the candle glow. It spoke Mrs. Helmsley's name. It used her Christian name, Catherine, pronounced with the particular emphasis her husband had always employed. It spoke of love that death had not diminished, of waiting in a place where pain did not exist, of watching over her during her lonely days and nights. Mrs. Helmsley responded with emotion that overwhelmed her usual composure, tears streaming down her face as she addressed the voice, asking if it was truly her husband, if he was at peace, if he forgave her for surviving when he had not. The voice reassured her, told her that death was only transition, that they would be reunited when her time came, that she must continue to live with purpose and faith. And then it spoke a phrase that only she and her husband had known, a line from a poem he had written for her on their wedding day, words never shared with another soul. Mrs. Helmsley made a sound between laughter and sobbing. Her grip on the hands beside her tightened convulsively, and in that moment of emotional intensity, something else happened. The candles extinguished simultaneously, plunging the room into absolute darkness. Someone screamed. Dr. Ashford called out for everyone to remain calm, to maintain the circle, but the circle had broken. Hands released hands, chair legs scraped against floorboards, and in the confusion and the darkness, a sound was heard that Dr. Ashford later described as resembling fabric tearing, or paper being violently crumpled, followed by a smell that several participants identified as earth and decay, though others claimed it was more like burning copper. Someone found matches. The gaslights were relit. The room swam back into visibility, and 7 people stood in various states of distress around the table, with one crucial exception. 6 people stood. Mrs. Catherine Helmsley's chair was empty. Her place at the table showed signs of recent occupation, the chair pushed slightly back. The cloth before her position disturbed, but the woman herself was absent. The door remained locked, the key still on the mantelpiece where it had been placed. The windows were latched from the inside, the servants were absent. The house was empty save for the 6 people in the drawing room. Mrs. Helmsley had vanished. The initial response was confusion rather than alarm. She must have stepped out during the darkness, though why she would do so without speaking was unclear. Perhaps the emotion had overwhelmed her, and she had needed to withdraw for privacy. Dr. Ashford unlocked the door and searched the immediate rooms, the hallway, the dining room, the library. The widowed friends searched the upper floors, calling Mrs. Helmsley's name, checking her bedroom and dressing room. The cousin investigated the servants' quarters and the kitchen. Madame Devereaux remained in the drawing room, seated now in a chair near the fireplace, her face pale and drawn, claiming exhaustion from the intensity of the manifestations. A quarter-hour passed without discovery. The house was not large, and there were only so many rooms to search. Mrs. Helmsley was not in any of them. Dr. Ashford returned to the drawing room and began asking direct questions. Had anyone seen Mrs. Helmsley leave her chair? Had anyone heard footsteps moving toward the door? Had anyone felt her pass them in the darkness? The answers were uniformly negative. One moment her hands had been part of the circle, the next they had released in the confusion when the candles went out, and after that no one could say with certainty what had occurred. The darkness had been complete, disorienting, and the emotional atmosphere had been charged with fear and confusion. Dr. Ashford examined the drawing room with methodical care. He checked the windows again, confirming that they were not only latched but painted shut, having not been opened in years. He examined the walls for hidden panels or concealed doors, finding none. He looked up the chimney, finding only soot and a damper that had not been disturbed. The room offered no apparent means of exit save the single door, which had been locked from the inside. He questioned Madame Devereaux, asking if she had noticed anything unusual during the séance, any indication that Mrs. Helmsley had intended to leave or had been in distress. The medium shook her head, her violet eyes reflecting the firelight, and said only that the spirits had been particularly strong tonight, that something had pressed through from the other side with unusual force, and that such intensity could have unpredictable effects. By 10 o'clock, the situation had progressed from confusion to genuine alarm. A servant returning early from her evening off was sent to fetch a constable. 2 officers arrived from the Marylebone station, stolid men accustomed to domestic disturbances, but unprepared for the circumstances they encountered. A woman had vanished from a locked room during a séance. There was no sign of forced entry, no indication of struggle, no rational explanation for her absence. The constables took statements from all present, their scepticism evident but their confusion equally apparent. One suggested that Mrs. Helmsley might have somehow left through the door during the darkness, though this did not explain how she had subsequently exited the locked house. The other proposed that the entire affair might be an elaborate hoax, though for what purpose none could say. The search expanded to the street outside, to the neighbouring properties, to the mews and gardens behind the terrace. Lanterns were lit. Constables knocked on doors, asking if anyone had seen a woman in evening dress wandering confused or distressed. The answers were negative. The December night was cold and damp, the fog thick enough to limit visibility to a few yards, but Mrs. Helmsley was not found in the street, not discovered unconscious in a garden, not located in any place that logic would suggest. She had simply ceased to be present in the physical world, or so it appeared to those who searched for her through the long hours until dawn. Madame Devereaux departed near midnight, giving her address to the constables and stating her availability for further questions. She walked back to her lodgings in Welbeck Street, her figure a black shape moving through the fog, and if anyone had followed her at sufficient distance, they might have noticed that she paused twice, once at the corner of Wimpole Street and once before entering her building, and stood perfectly still as though listening to something only she could hear, her head tilted at that peculiar angle, her lips moving in what might have been prayer or might have been something else, something older than prayer, something that predated churches and crosses and all the consolations of Christian faith. By morning, the disappearance was the primary topic of conversation in a dozen households. By evening, the newspapers had the story. The Evening Standard ran it on the third page under the headline, "Lady Vanishes During Spiritualist Séance." The account was factual but sensational in its implications, noting the locked room, the multiple witnesses, the absence of any logical explanation. Other papers followed, each adding speculations and theories. Had Mrs. Helmsley been the victim of an elaborate confidence scheme? Had she staged her own disappearance for reasons unknown? Had something genuinely supernatural occurred? The spiritualist community was divided between those who saw the event as validation of their beliefs and those who feared it would bring unwanted scrutiny and mockery. Scotland Yard received formal notification of the disappearance on Saturday morning. The case was assigned to the detective branch, though with what priority was unclear given the absence of any evidence of foul play. A woman was missing, but women sometimes left their homes for private reasons, to escape debt, to pursue romantic entanglements, to flee circumstances they found unbearable. That Mrs. Helmsley had been wealthy, respectable, and apparently content made such explanations less convincing, but they could not be entirely dismissed. The investigation proceeded along routine lines. Mrs. Helmsley's finances were examined, revealing nothing irregular. Her correspondence was reviewed, showing only ordinary social and charitable communications. Her friends and servants were questioned repeatedly, producing no new information. And the drawing room at Wimpole Street was examined by increasingly frustrated constables who found no hidden mechanisms, no concealed passages, nothing that would explain how a living woman could vanish from a locked space. On the mantelpiece in that drawing room, placed there by person or persons unknown at some point after the disappearance, sat a single white lily in a small vase. It had not been there during the séance. Multiple witnesses confirmed this. It had appeared sometime during the confusion, or perhaps afterwards when the house was being searched, or possibly later still when the constables had briefly left the room unattended. The lily was fresh, its petals unstained, its stem green and firm. But within 3 days it had begun to rot, the petals browning and curling, the scent of decay filling the room. Despite the December cold, the flower collapsing into itself as though months rather than days had passed. The servants refused to touch it. The constables photographed it as evidence, and it remained there, decomposing, until someone finally threw it into the fire, where it burned with a flame that witnesses described as unnaturally green, leaving an ash that smelled of something that was not quite botanical, not quite chemical, but something in between, something wrong. Mrs. Catherine Helmsley was not found on Saturday, nor on Sunday, nor in the week that followed. She had vanished as completely as if the earth had opened and swallowed her, and the only trace of her fate was the rotting flower and the memory of a voice in the darkness calling her name, beckoning her towards something that might have been reunion, or might have been something else entirely, something that wore the face of love but served purposes far more ancient and far less kind than mere human affection. Chapter 4. The Inspector's Arrival. Edmund Grayson received notification of his assignment to the Helmsley case on Monday morning, the 10th of December, delivered to his desk at Scotland Yard in the form of a memorandum from Chief Inspector Aberline. Grayson read the document twice, his expression unchanging, before setting it aside and reaching for his coat. He was 38 years old, a veteran of 12 years in the Metropolitan Police, the last 5 spent in the detective branch investigating cases that ranged from forgery to murder. He had earned a reputation for thoroughness and for a particular quality that his superiors valued, an absolute imperviousness to sentiment and superstition. Where other men saw mystery, Grayson saw only facts waiting to be uncovered. Where others invoked the inexplicable, He invoked patience and method. He did not believe in ghosts, in spirits, in divine intervention, or demonic possession. He believed in human nature, which was consistent and predictable, and in evidence, which was either present or absent, but never supernatural. He walked from Scotland Yard to Wimpole Street, preferring the exercise to the confinement of a cab, and because he thought better while moving through the city. London in December was a study in grey sky, grey stone, grey fog that softened the edges of buildings and muffled sound until the metropolis felt smaller than its actual vastness. He passed through streets where vendors called their wares, where omnibuses rattled over cobblestones, where women in shawls hurried between shops and men in silk hats strode with the confidence of those who owned rather than laboured. He'd grown up in these streets, the son of a clerk who drank his wages and a mother who took in sewing to feed her children. He had learned early that the world was not kind, not fair, and not guided by any benevolent force. He had learned that survival required clear sight and hard work, and he had applied these lessons with sufficient success to raise himself from Seven Dials to the detective branch, from poverty to respectability, from powerlessness to a position where he could occasionally impose order on chaos. The house on Wimpole Street was under the observation of a constable when Grayson arrived. The man straightened upon recognising a superior officer prepared to deliver his report. Grayson waved him to silence, preferring to form his own impressions before hearing accounts filtered through others' perceptions. He entered the house using a key provided by Mrs. Helmsley's solicitor, who had been given authority to manage the property during her absence. The interior was as he had expected from the address, comfortably furnished without ostentation, decorated in the style favoured by the widows of modest wealth, everything correct and proper and utterly without personality. He moved through the ground floor rooms, taking note of details that meant nothing individually but might form pattern when assembled. The servants' quarters were orderly. The kitchen showed evidence of recent cleaning. The library held books on spiritualism and theology, suggesting the missing woman's interests, alongside novels and poetry that suggested conventional taste. He climbed the stairs to the first floor and entered the drawing room where the séance had occurred. The room had been sealed since the initial investigation, the door locked and the constables instructed to permit no entry. Grayson stood in the doorway for a long moment before stepping inside, allowing his eyes to adjust to the dimmer light, allowing his mind to absorb the space without the distraction of immediate purpose. The black cloth still covered the table, the coloured glass holders still held candle stubs. The lily that had appeared mysteriously now lay in the fireplace, reduced to ash but still recognisable in outline, the vase beside it empty. He examined the windows first, testing the latches, confirming what the reports had stated. They were not only locked but sealed with paint, impossible to open quickly or quietly. He examined the walls, tapping at intervals, listening for hollow sounds that might indicate concealed spaces. He found none. The floor received his attention next. He moved furniture aside and rolled back the carpet, examining the boards for signs of disturbance, for marks that might indicate a trapdoor or concealed passage. Victorian houses occasionally contained such features, remnants of earlier construction or additions made for purposes both innocent and otherwise. He found nothing. The boards were solid, well-fitted, showing age, but no indication of having been lifted or altered. The ceiling was equally unremarkable, plaster with moulded cornices, no obvious access to the space above. The chimney drew his sustained examination. He removed the fire screen and damper, peering up into the flue with the aid of a lantern. Soot and brick, narrow at the top, impossible for an adult human to negotiate. He replaced the damper and turned his attention to the door. The lock was standard for the period, operated by a key from either side or by a thumb turn from the interior. On the night of the disappearance, the key had been placed on the mantelpiece in view of all participants. The door locked from inside, no possibility of exit, without either retrieving the key or possessing a duplicate. Grayson examined the mantelpiece carefully, the surface showing dust disturbed by the placement and removal of the objects. He examined the lock mechanism itself, finding it functional and showing no signs of tampering. He stood with his back to the door, recreating the scene as described in the witness statements. 7 people seated around the table, hands joined, candles providing minimal light, then darkness when the candles were extinguished, then confusion and the discovery of absence. He spent an hour in that room measuring distances, testing sight lines, attempting to reconstruct the sequence of events in purely physical terms. A woman had been present. The same woman had ceased to be present. This required either movement through space or some form of concealment. Movement seemed impossible given the locked door and sealed windows. Concealment then, but where? He searched again, more carefully this time, removing books from shelves, examining furniture for hidden compartments, even pressing against walls in the unlikely hope of discovering a pivot panel. Nothing. The room offered no solution to the problem it presented. He left the drawing room and descended to interview the servants, who'd been retained by the solicitor pending resolution of Mrs. Helmsley's status. The cook, the housemaid, and the lady's maid sat in the kitchen drinking tea and speaking in low voices that ceased when Grayson entered. He introduced himself without ceremony and began asking questions. What had been Mrs. Helmsley's state of mind in the days before the disappearance? Had she seemed distressed, secretive, unusual in any regard? The servants exchanged glances before responding. She had been much as always, they said, quiet, kind, regular in her habits. She had attended séances with increasing frequency over the past months, but this was known and not hidden. She had received no suspicious visitors, no letters that prompted unusual reactions. She had given no indication of intending to leave her home or to do anything other than continue her established routine. Had she mentioned Madame Devereaux before engaging her services? Yes, several times. She had spoken of the medium with respect and hope, had attended group séances before arranging the private sitting. Had she seemed frightened of the medium or uncomfortable with the spiritualist practices? Not at all. She had been eager, hopeful, desperate even to make contact with her late husband. And on the night of the séance, when the servants were given the evening free, had this been at Mrs. Helmsley's instruction or at Madame Devereaux's request? Mrs. Helmsley had told them they need not stay, that she wished the house to be quiet, that they should enjoy their free time. This was unusual but not unprecedented. She had occasionally given them evenings off when hosting gatherings she preferred to keep private. Grayson thanked the servants and departed, walking back towards Scotland Yard through streets growing dark as the December afternoon faded. His mind worked through possibilities, discarding those that required supernatural explanation, focusing on those rooted in human capability and motive. A woman had vanished from a locked room. This was not possible. Therefore it had not happened as reported. Some element of the accounts must be false, some detail misremembered, or deliberately concealed. Perhaps Mrs. Helmsley had left before the door was locked, hiding elsewhere in the house during the search, but the servants had been absent and the subsequent searches had been thorough. Perhaps she had confederates who assisted her departure through means not yet discovered. But what motive would prompt a respectable widow to stage such an elaborate disappearance? Or perhaps the disappearance was not voluntary. Perhaps Mrs. Helmsley had been the victim of a crime, removed from the drawing room by someone who had used the séance as cover. But this required the cooperation or distraction of all witnesses, and it required means of egress that Grayson had not found despite careful examination. The problem circled back upon itself, offering no clear path forward. He required more information, and there was one source he had not yet consulted, the medium herself, Madame Estella Devereaux, whose séances seemed to stand at the centre of events like a spider at the heart of a web. He obtained her address from the constable's report and made his way to Welbeck Street as evening settled over the city. The lodging-house was respectable. The landlady who answered his knock was suspicious but cooperative when he showed his warrant card, and within minutes he was climbing the stairs to the second floor where Madame Devereaux maintained her rooms. He knocked. A voice called for him to enter. He pushed open the door and stepped into a space that surprised him with its austerity. He had expected theatrical trappings, the paraphernalia of the professional spiritualist, Crystal balls, occult symbols, dramatic drapery. Instead, he found rooms furnished simply, almost Spartanly, with little decoration beyond a few books and a single painting of indeterminate subject matter. And seated in a chair by the window, silhouetted against the gaslight from the street below, was the woman herself. She did not rise when he entered, did not offer greeting or inquiry as to his purpose. She simply looked at him with those violet eyes, and Grayson felt an unexpected discomfort under that gaze, as though he were being assessed by senses other than sight, as though she saw not merely his physical form, but something deeper, something he kept carefully hidden from the world. He mastered the sensation with the discipline of long practice and introduced himself formally, stating his position and his purpose to investigate the disappearance of Mrs. Catherine Helmsley from a séance conducted in this woman's presence. Madame Devereaux inclined her head slightly, acknowledging his introduction. Her voice when she spoke carried the accent he had read about in the reports, French primarily but with undertones of elsewhere, and it possessed a quality that he could only describe as gravity, as though each word had been weighed before being released. She had given her statement to the constables, she said. She had nothing to add to that account. The séance had proceeded normally, until the candles were extinguished. In the confusion that followed, Mrs. Helmsley had vanished. She could not explain how this had occurred. She could only report what she knew to be true, that the spirits summoned during séances were real, that they possessed power beyond human understanding, and that occasionally they acted in ways that defied explanation or expectation. Grayson listened without interrupting, then posed his questions with the directness he employed in all interrogations. Had she extinguished the candles herself? No. They had gone out simultaneously without any physical agency she could identify. Had she risen from her chair during the darkness? No. She had remained seated throughout, as the other witnesses could confirm. Had she observed anything unusual before the darkness descended? Only the intensity of the manifestations, which had been stronger than in previous sittings. And after Mrs. Helmsley's disappearance was discovered, had she searched the room herself? No. She had been too exhausted from the séance to do more than sit and recover. Did she have any theory as to what had happened to Mrs. Helmsley? Madame Devereaux regarded him for a long moment before responding, and when she did, her answer sent a chill through the room that Grayson felt despite his scepticism. Mrs. Helmsley had wanted too much, she said. She had called to her husband with such desperate need that something had answered. Perhaps it was her husband's spirit. Perhaps it was something else, something that wore her husband's voice and a manner, but served different purposes. The spirits were not always benevolent. The barrier between worlds was meant to remain intact. Those who pierced it too often or too deeply risked consequences that the living were not meant to understand. Grayson pressed her for specifics, for evidence, for anything beyond mystical speculation. She offered none. She simply sat in her chair and looked at him with those unsettling eyes and told him that he did not believe, and that was well. Because belief made one vulnerable to things that disbelief could not prevent, but could at least allow one to face with clear mind. She suggested that he leave such matters to those with understanding. She suggested that some mysteries were better left unsolved. She suggested that Mrs. Helmsley had passed beyond the reach of earthly investigation, and that attempting to follow would serve no purpose but to invite danger. Grayson left her rooms 15 minutes later, his temper frayed by the encounter, his determination hardened by her evasions. She knew something, he was certain. Whether she was a charlatan who had somehow engineered Mrs. Helmsley's removal or something more complex, he could not yet say, but he would discover the truth through method and persistence, through the application of reason to circumstances that only appeared inexplicable. He would find Mrs. Helmsley, living or dead. He would expose whatever human agency had caused her disappearance, and he would do so without recourse to spirits, séances, or any other manifestation of the delusion that plagued those who could not face mortality without inventing comfortable fictions. He walked back through the fog-bound streets, and behind him in her rooms on Welbeck Street, Madame Devereaux sat unmoving in her chair, her hands folded in her lap, her face turned toward the window, watching something in the darkness that Edmund Grayson would have insisted was not there. Watching and whispering words in a language older than English, older than French, older than the Latin from which both descended, calling to things that should not be called, binding things that should not be bound, and knowing with a certainty that brought her no comfort that the inspector would soon discover truths he was not prepared to face, and that when he did, the rational world he trusted would crack like ice beneath his feet, plunging him into depths where reason held no light, and human law offered no protection. Chapter 5. The pattern emerges. The second disappearance occurred on the evening of December the 14th, exactly 1 week after Mrs. Helmsley had vanished from the locked drawing room. The victim was a Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard, aged 37, widow of a naval officer who had drowned when his vessel foundered in a storm off Gibraltar 4 years prior. She lived in Bloomsbury in a house somewhat smaller than Mrs. Helmsley's but equally respectable, and she had become acquainted with spiritualism through a friend who attended the Church of the Ascension, where certain progressive clergy did not discourage their parishioners from seeking comfort in mediumship alongside more orthodox consolations. Mrs. Pritchard had never attended one of Madame Devereaux's séances. Her medium of choice was a younger woman, a Miss Sarah Corbett, who operated from lodgings in Fitzrovia and who specialised in automatic writing, the practice of allowing spirits to guide her hand across paper, producing messages in handwriting that supposedly belonged to the deceased. Miss Corbett charged modest fees and maintained a small but devoted following among widows and bereaved mothers who found her gentle manner and seemingly genuine distress at the suffering of others to be more comforting than the theatrical performances of more prominent mediums. She claimed no spirit guides, no control over which entities manifested, only a willingness to serve as conduit between worlds when the spirits chose to communicate. The séance took place in Mrs. Pritchard's own parlour as had been requested. 5 women attended, Mrs. Pritchard, Miss Corbett, and 3 friends who shared Mrs. Pritchard's interest in spiritualist matters. The arrangement was informal, more reminiscent of a ladies' tea circle than the dramatic sittings conducted by professional mediums in darkened rooms. The gaslights remained lit, though dimmed. The participants sat in comfortable chairs arranged in a loose semicircle. Miss Corbett held a pencil and several sheets of writing paper, her hands resting lightly on a small table before her. The women joined hands only briefly at the beginning, offering a prayer for protection and guidance, then released to allow Miss Corbett the freedom to write when the spirits moved her. The first hour passed pleasantly. Miss Corbett's hand began to move, slowly at first, then with increasing speed and confidence, producing lines of script that slanted dramatically across the page. She read aloud what had been written, messages from the deceased father of one participant, advice from the late mother of another, reassurances of continued love and the promise of eventual reunion. The messages were conventional but comforting, and the recipients accepted them with gratitude. Mrs. Pritchard had been hoping for contact with her husband, and when Miss Corbett's hand suddenly jerked and began writing in a different style, more forceful and angular, everyone present felt the shift in atmosphere. The message that emerged was addressed to Eleanor using the familiar form that Captain Pritchard had employed with his wife. It spoke of the sea, of the moment of drowning, of terror giving way to peace, of a journey across dark waters to a shore where pain did not exist. It spoke of watching over her, of pride in how she had managed her grief and her life, of wanting her to know that death was not the end but only passage to something larger and more beautiful than mortal existence could encompass. Mrs. Pritchard wept as Miss Corbett read the words aloud. Whoa. Her voice soft and filled with emotion, and then the handwriting changed again, becoming wilder, the letters nearly illegible, and the message that followed was not comforting. It spoke of danger, it spoke of something waiting in the darkness between worlds, something that fed on grief and longing, something that wore the faces of the dead to lure the living closer to boundaries that should not be crossed. It warned Mrs. Pritchard to cease attending séances, to abandon her quest for contact, to live in the world of sunlight and flesh, and leave the dead to their rest. The warning was urgent, almost panicked, and it was signed not with Captain Pritchard's name, but with a symbol that none present recognised, a circle with a vertical line through it, bisected by a horizontal line, like a cross confined within a sphere. Miss Corbett dropped the pencil as though it had burned her fingers. She gasped, her face draining of colour, and said that something cold had passed through her, something that was not like the spirits who normally communicated through her gift. The other women murmured with concern, offering water and reassurance. Mrs. Pritchard took the pages of automatic writing and read them again, troubled by the warning but unable to understand what specific danger she faced. Miss Corbett apologised, saying she thought perhaps they should conclude the sitting, that the atmosphere had become strained and continuation might invite further disturbance. The others agreed, relieved to break the tension that had developed. They rose from their chairs, preparing to depart, when the gaslights began to flicker, not dimming gradually but pulsing, bright, then dark, then bright again, in a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate. One of the friends suggested that something might be wrong with the gas supply, that perhaps a valve needed adjustment. But before anyone could investigate, the lights went out entirely, plunging the parlour into darkness that was not quite complete. The fire in the grate still burned, and the window showed the gaslit street beyond. In that dimness, with the fire casting moving shadows across the walls, a sound was heard that none of the women could later describe with precision. It was not a voice, not precisely, but something between voice and wind, between word and breath, and it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, filling the room with a presence that pressed against skin like invisible hands. The gaslights returned as suddenly as they had failed. The sound ceased, and Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard was no longer in the parlour. Her chair stood empty, her shawl lay across its back. The pages of automatic writing remained on the table where she had placed them, but the woman herself had vanished as completely as though she had never existed. The 4 remaining women stood frozen in shock, unable immediately to process what their senses reported. Miss Corbett broke the paralysis by screaming, a high sound of pure terror that brought several servants running from the kitchen and a neighbour pounding at the front door. The search that followed was thorough and immediate. The house was small, easily examined from cellar to attic within the span of half an hour. Mrs. Pritchard was not found. The doors and windows were locked from the inside. The servants had been in the kitchen throughout, had heard nothing unusual until Miss Corbett's scream. The neighbours had seen nothing, no one entering or leaving the property. A constable was summoned, then another, then a sergeant who recognised the disturbing similarity to the Helmsley case and sent word immediately to Scotland Yard that a second widow had disappeared during a séance, under circumstances that defied logical explanation. Edmund Grayson received the news at midnight, delivered to his rooms by a breathless constable who had been dispatched across the city with instructions to wake the inspector if necessary. Grayson dressed quickly and made his way through the fog-thick streets to Bloomsbury, arriving at Mrs. Pritchard's house to find it lit like a beacon in the December darkness, every gaslight burning, constables moving through rooms with lanterns. Neighbours gathered on the pavement speaking in hushed voices about evil spirits and divine judgment and the wages of trafficking with demons. He pushed through the crowd and entered the house, immediately taking charge of the investigation, his manner brooking no argument from the local officers who had secured the scene. He interviewed the witnesses separately, comparing accounts, searching for discrepancies that might indicate collusion or deception. The stories aligned too perfectly for comfort. 5 women had been present. The lights had failed. A sound had been heard. The lights had returned. 1 woman was missing. No one had seen or heard her leave. No one had noticed her absence until the lights revealed her empty chair. Miss Corbett was nearly hysterical, convinced that malevolent spirits had claimed Mrs. Pritchard, that her warnings through automatic writing had come too late, that all who participated in séances risked similar fate. The other 3 witnesses were badly shaken but more coherent, able to provide details and answer questions, though their answers only deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. Grayson examined the parlour with the same methodical attention he had brought to the Wimpole Street drawing room. The results were identical. No hidden passages, no concealed doors, no means of exit beyond the ordinary entrance through which everyone had come and which had been observed by servants throughout. The windows were small, high, unsuited to egress even if they had been unlatched. The fireplace flue was too narrow for human passage. The room offered no solution to the impossible problem it presented. A woman had been present, then absent, with no physical explanation for the transition between states. He interviewed Miss Corbett at length, pressing her about the automatic writing, about the warning message, about the symbol that had appeared at the bottom of the page. She could tell him little beyond what she had already stated. She did not consciously control what her hand wrote during sittings. She entered a state of receptivity, allowing spirits to guide her movements, and only afterward read what had been produced. The warning had disturbed her precisely because it was unlike the usual messages, darker and more urgent, suggesting dangers she did not understand. The symbol meant nothing to her. She had never seen it before and could not explain its significance. Grayson took possession of the automatic writing pages, folding them carefully and placing them in his coat pocket. He would examine them more closely in daylight, would perhaps consult experts in symbolism or occult matters, though he approached such consultation with deep reluctance. He did not believe in spirits or supernatural forces, but he was beginning to recognize that someone involved in these séances believed very strongly indeed, believed enough to stage elaborate disappearances for purposes he could not yet fathom. 2 widows, both vanished during spiritualist sittings, both removed from locked rooms without apparent means. The similarities suggested pattern. Pattern suggested intent. Intent suggested human agency regardless of supernatural trappings. The 3rd disappearance occurred before he could make significant progress on the first 2. It happened on December 19th, 5 days after Mrs. Pritchard's vanishing, in a house in Kensington where a widow named Mrs. Harriet Blackwood had arranged a séance with yet another medium. A man this time, a Mr. Joshua Kent, who claimed to produce physical manifestations, spirit hands that could be touched, objects that moved without contact, materializations of ectoplasm that took vaguely human form before dissolving. Mr. Kent was known in spiritualist circles as either a remarkable medium or a talented fraud depending on one's perspective, and he had been investigated by the Society for Psychical Research on multiple occasions without definitive conclusion regarding the authenticity of his phenomena. The séance followed the now familiar pattern. A small group, 6 participants including Mr. Kent, gathered in a darkened room with minimal light provided by a single candle placed at safe distance from the table. They joined hands, sang hymns, created the atmosphere of expectation and belief necessary for manifestation. Mr. Kent went into trance, his breathing becoming laboured, his body rigid. And then the phenomena began. Knocking sounds, cold drafts, the sensation of invisible hands touching faces and shoulders, and finally a pale, luminous substance that seemed to emerge from Mr. Kent's chest and float through the air like smoke given temporary solidity. Mrs. Blackwood had been hoping for contact with her late husband, a solicitor who had died of heart failure 18 months prior. She received that contact, or appeared to, when a voice emerged from the darkness claiming to be her beloved Henry. Speaking with inflection she recognized, referring to memories they had shared. She asked questions, received answers, wept with the relief of one who has received confirmation that death is not permanent separation. And then, as had happened in the previous 2 cases, something shifted in the atmosphere. The temperature dropped precipitously. The phenomena intensified beyond what Mr. Kent's sittings normally produced. The luminous substance grew brighter, taking on a shape that suggested human form but was not quite human. Proportions wrong, movements unnatural. Mr. Kent emerged from trance abruptly, his voice sharp with alarm, telling everyone to break the circle, to light the gaslights, to end the séance immediately. But before anyone could respond, the candle extinguished itself. Darkness fell. A sound like wind rushed through the sealed room, and when light was restored moments later through the frantic striking of matches, Mrs. Harriet Blackwood's chair was empty, the woman gone without trace, the room locked from within, the witnesses too shocked to do more than stare at the space where she had been. Grayson learned of the third disappearance the following morning. He stood in his office at Scotland Yard, 3 case files spread across his desk, and recognised with a certainty that settled like cold weight in his stomach that he was not dealing with coincidence or with isolated incidents, but with something systematic, something planned, something that used séances as hunting grounds and widows as prey. 3 women, 3 different mediums, 3 locked rooms, 3 impossible vanishings. The pattern was clear even if the mechanism remained obscure. He arranged the facts in columns on a sheet of paper, looking for commonalities beyond the obvious. All 3 victims were widows between 35 and 45 years of age. All 3 had been actively seeking contact with deceased husbands. All 3 had disappeared during séances conducted in their own homes. All 3 séances had involved moments of darkness or visual obscurity when the disappearances occurred. All 3 cases featured phenomena that exceeded the normal theatrics of spiritualist sittings, the extinguishing of candles, the dramatic drop in temperature, sounds and sensations that disturbed even the mediums conducting the sessions. But there were differences as well. 3 different mediums, none of whom had connection to the others that Grayson could discover. 3 different locations across London, with no geographic pattern suggesting a single perpetrator working from a fixed base. 3 different styles of mediumship, trance channeling, automatic writing, physical manifestation. If someone was engineering these disappearances, they were doing so with remarkable flexibility, adapting their method to different circumstances while maintaining consistent results. Grayson spent the afternoon visiting the mediums, Miss Corbett first, finding her still distraught, barely able to speak without dissolving into tears, then Mr. Kent, who received him in lodgings cluttered with spiritualist apparatus and books on occult philosophy, and who insisted with genuine conviction that he had nearly lost control of the séance, that something had forced its way through from the other side despite his attempts to close the channel, that he would never conduct another sitting because he feared for his own safety and sanity. And finally, though he had interviewed her before, he returned to Madame Devereaux because her séance had been the first, and first incidents often held keys to understanding subsequent events. She received him in the same chair by the same window, her posture unchanged from his previous visit, as though she had not moved in the intervening days. He told her about the second and third disappearances, watching her face for reaction. She showed none, only listened with that unsettling attentiveness, those violet eyes fixed on his face. When he finished, she spoke a single sentence. "The barrier is weakening." He asked what she meant. She said that every séance tears the veil a little more, that the dead press against the boundary between worlds with increasing force, that something ancient and hungry had learned to use that pressure for its own purposes, that the disappearances would continue until someone with knowledge of such matters performed the necessary rituals to seal what had been opened. Grayson rejected this explanation with every rational fibre of his being. But he could not reject the facts. 3 women missing, no bodies discovered, no ransom demands received, no logical explanation available despite thorough investigation. He left Madame Devereaux's rooms with the uncomfortable suspicion that she knew more than she claimed, that perhaps all 3 mediums were involved in conspiracy of some kind. Though what they stood to gain from making their clients disappear, he could not imagine. Mediums profited from continued patronage, not from events that would destroy their reputations and invite official scrutiny. He returned to Scotland Yard as evening settled over the city, the December darkness coming early, the fog rising from the Thames to swallow the gaslights one by one. He sat at his desk and stared at the 3 case files until the words blurred before his eyes. 3 women gone into darkness, 3 impossible crimes. And somewhere in London, someone or something was preparing to claim a 4th victim, because patterns once established tended to continue until broken by intervention or exhaustion. Grayson did not believe in ghosts or demons or spirits, but he was beginning to believe that someone wanted others to believe, and that the belief was being weaponized in ways he had never encountered during his years investigating human wickedness. He would find the truth. He would expose the mechanism by which these disappearances were achieved, and he would do so before another widow vanished from a locked room, leaving nothing behind but questions that defied rational answer, and a creeping suspicion that perhaps, just perhaps, the boundary between possible and impossible was not as fixed as he had always assumed. Chapter 6. The Medium's Circle. The discovery that London's spiritualist mediums formed a loose but definite society came not through Grayson's investigation, but through an article published in the Spiritualist, a weekly newspaper dedicated to matters of psychical research and mediumship. The article, which appeared on December the 21st, bore the title Unity Among the Gifted, and described a gathering that had taken place the previous summer at a private residence in Hampstead. 23 mediums had attended, representing various styles and approaches to spirit communication, and they had spent 3 days in discussion and demonstration, sharing techniques and experiences, debating questions of authenticity and ethics, and establishing what the article called fraternal bonds among those who served the departed. Grayson obtained a copy of the newspaper from a vendor in Charing Cross Road and read the article twice, his interest sharpening with each paragraph. The gathering had included Miss Sarah Corbett, it had included Mr. Joshua Kent, and it had been organised by and held at the residence of Madame Estella Devereaux, who apparently maintained a country house outside London in addition to her Marylebone lodgings. The article made no mention of conspiracy or coordination, presenting the gathering as entirely benign, but to Grayson's suspicious mind it represented precisely what he had been seeking: a connection among the mediums whose séances had produced disappearances, a proof that they knew one another and had opportunity to plan whatever elaborate deception they were perpetrating. He spent the following day investigating the Hampstead property. The address was provided in the article, and he travelled there by train and then hired cab, arriving at a house that sat well back from the road, screened by bare winter trees and surrounded by grounds that suggested considerable wealth. The house was Georgian, built of brick that had weathered to a deep red, with tall windows and a portico supported by white columns. It appeared unoccupied. No smoke rose from the chimneys, no light showed in the windows despite the afternoon gloom. He approached the front door and found it locked, the knocker removed, a notice posted indicating that the property was closed for the season, and inquiries should be directed to a firm of solicitors in Holborn. Grayson walked the perimeter of the grounds, looking for signs of recent activity, for evidence that the house might be serving as base for the crimes he suspected. He found nothing conclusive. The gardens were dormant, the paths unswept, the windows shuttered. But at the rear of the property, near what appeared to be a conservatory or greenhouse, he noticed something that arrested his attention. The ground was disturbed, the earth recently turned, forming a rectangle perhaps 6 feet by 3 feet, the dimensions of a grave. Frost covered the disturbed soil, but beneath the white crust he could see the darker colour of freshly worked earth, indicating that whatever digging had occurred had happened within the past few days. He had no authority to excavate without warrant, and obtaining a warrant required evidence more substantial than disturbed earth that might represent nothing more than gardening activity. He noted the location carefully, fixed it in memory with reference to nearby landmarks, and continued his circuit of the property. The conservatory's glass was intact but filmed with condensation, making it impossible to see the interior clearly. He tried the door and found it locked. He peered through the glass, shading his eyes against reflection, and thought he saw shapes inside that might have been furniture draped in cloth or might have been something else. Forms too large to be furniture. Forms that suggested verticality and mass, but not any specific identity. He returned to London as darkness fell, his mind working through possibilities. If the mediums were conspiring together, if they were somehow responsible for the disappearances, then Madame Devereaux's country house might serve as location where the missing women were being held. but this raised more questions than it answered. Why take the women? For what purpose? Ransom had not been demanded. Bodies had not been discovered. The crimes, if they were crimes and not genuine supernatural occurrences, produced no apparent benefit to the perpetrators, unless the benefit was less tangible, reputation for instance. Mediums whose séances produced dramatic phenomena would attract more clients, command higher fees, but disappearances invited investigation, not patronage. The logic failed to cohere. He decided to approach the problem from another angle, to investigate the victims themselves more thoroughly, to search for commonalities beyond widowhood that might explain why they specifically had been targeted. He spent the next 2 days reviewing the case files again, interviewing the families and friends of the missing women, examining their correspondence and financial records for patterns or connections. The effort yielded little. The 3 women had not known one another. They moved in different social circles, attended different churches, supported different charities. Their late husbands had worked in different professions and died in different circumstances. The only connection was their grief and their subsequent involvement in spiritualism, and even there their paths had been different until the moment of their disappearances. On December the 23rd, 2 days before Christmas, Grayson received an unexpected visitor at Scotland Yard. A man in clerical dress was shown into his office, introducing himself as Reverend Thomas Ashfield, rector of St. Marylebone Parish Church. He had come, he explained, because he had information that might prove relevant to the investigation of the missing widows. Information that he had been reluctant to share but felt duty-bound to disclose given the severity of the situation. Grayson offered him a chair and listened with full attention as the rector began to speak. Reverend Ashfield had known Mrs. Catherine Helmsley through parish activities. She had been a regular attendee at services until approximately 6 months prior to her disappearance, at which point her attendance had become irregular. He had called upon her to inquire if she was ill or troubled, and she had received him cordially, but had been evasive about her reasons for avoiding church. Eventually, after some gentle pressing, she had confessed that she had begun attending séances, that she found more comfort in the possibility of continued communication with her husband than in the church's promise of eventual reunion in heaven. She had asked if this was sinful, if she was endangering her soul. Reverend Ashfield had advised caution, had warned against deception and false comfort, but had not condemned her outright, recognizing that grief took many forms and that the human need for connection with the dead was neither new nor easily dismissed. What troubled him now, what had brought him to Scotland Yard, was a conversation he had overheard approximately 1 month before Mrs. Helmsley's disappearance. He had been visiting a parishioner, a widow named Mrs. Thornton, who lived near Wimpole Street, and as he walked along the pavement toward her house, he had passed 2 women engaged in conversation outside a milliner's shop. One of them was Mrs. Helmsley. The other was a woman he did not recognize, dressed in black with a foreign accent. They had not noticed him as he passed, and their conversation, while not precisely secret, had a quality that suggested confidential exchange. He had heard only fragments, but certain phrases had lodged in his memory. The woman in black had said something about the strongest ones, about those who call with the most need, about the veil being thinnest where grief tears at it. Grayson leaned forward in his chair. Could Reverend Ashfield describe the woman in black? The rector did his best. Dark hair, pale complexion, striking eyes of unusual colour, perhaps violet or deep blue. The description matched Madame Devereaux precisely, and the conversation suggested, if Reverend Ashfield's memory was accurate, that the medium had been selecting her victims, identifying those whose grief made them most vulnerable, most likely to respond to the promise of contact with the departed. But selecting them for what purpose remained unclear. Grayson thanked the rector and saw him out, then sat for a long time staring at the wall of his office where he had pinned maps and notes relating to the case. The pattern was becoming clearer, though the purpose behind it remained obscure. Madame Devereaux stood at the centre. She had conducted the first séance. She had organised the gathering where other mediums had met. She had been observed in conversation with at least one victim before the disappearances began. but she had not conducted all 3 séances. Miss Corbett and Mr. Kent had no obvious motive to assist her in crimes that damaged their own reputations, unless they were not assisting but were themselves being manipulated, used in some scheme whose full dimensions Grayson had not yet grasped. He decided that direct confrontation was required. He would arrest Madame Devereaux on suspicion of conspiracy, would search her lodgings and her country property, would subject her to interrogation that might crack whatever facade she maintained. But before he could act on this decision, he received word that a 4th widow had arranged a séance scheduled for that very evening, December the 23rd, with none other than Madame Devereaux herself. The information came from Dr. Marcus Ashford, the physician who had attended the first séance where Mrs. Helmsley had vanished. Dr. Ashford had remained in contact with the spiritualist community, driven by scientific curiosity and genuine concern for the safety of those who continued to attend sittings, despite the recent tragedies. The widow in question was a Mrs. Margaret Sutherland, age 41, whose husband had died. In a railway accident the previous spring, she lived in Mayfair, possessed considerable wealth, and had been grief-stricken to the point of illness after her husband's death. She had attended several séances over the past months, and had finally secured an appointment with Madame Devereaux, whom she regarded as the most gifted medium in London. Dr. Ashford had attempted to dissuade her from attending, citing the mysterious disappearances, but Mrs. Sutherland had insisted that those tragedies were proof of genuine supernatural activity rather than evidence of danger. She believed that the missing women had been claimed by spirits, had passed willingly into the afterlife to join their beloved dead, and she half hoped that the same fate might befall her. Grayson realised that he had been presented with an opportunity that might not recur. If Madame Devereaux was engineering these disappearances, if she planned to make Mrs. Sutherland her 4th victim, then attending the séance would allow him to witness her method, to observe how an impossible crime was committed, and to intervene before another woman vanished. The risk was considerable. If supernatural forces were genuinely involved, which he did not believe but could not entirely discount, then his presence might invite danger he was unprepared to face. But the potential benefit outweighed the risk. He would attend the séance. He would watch with trained observer's eye, and he would prevent whatever was planned, whether by human or inhuman agency. He made arrangements quickly. He contacted Ashford and requested an introduction to Mrs. Sutherland, presenting himself not as a police inspector, but as a skeptical investigator interested in documenting spiritualist phenomena. Mrs. Sutherland, eager to demonstrate the validity of her beliefs, agreed to his attendance. He sent word to 2 constables to position themselves outside Mrs. Sutherland's house during the séance, with instructions to prevent anyone from entering or leaving until he gave signal that all was well. He checked his revolver, a weapon he rarely carried but felt justified in taking given the circumstances, and as evening approached and the December darkness settled over London, he made his way to Mayfair, to a house blazing with gaslight, to a parlour where a circle would form around a table draped in black cloth, to a séance that he intended to observe with rational detachment, never suspecting that what he would experience in that darkened room would shake the foundations of his certainty and force him to confront possibilities he had spent his entire adult life denying. Chapter 7. The Séance Trap. Mrs. Margaret Sutherland's house stood on Mount Street, a short walk from Grosvenor Square, in one of those rows of elegant townhouses that proclaimed wealth without ostentation. The facade was Portland stone, the windows tall and numerous, the entrance marked by a fanlight of etched glass, and a door painted glossy black with brass fittings that reflected the gaslight from the street lamps. Grayson arrived at 7:15, as had been arranged, and was admitted by a butler whose livery suggested the household maintained standards appropriate to the address. He was shown to a drawing room on the first floor where Mrs. Sutherland received him with the nervous energy of one who has been anticipating an event with mixture of hope and dread. She was younger than he had expected from Dr. Ashford's description, or perhaps grief had aged her in ways not visible to casual observation. Her face was hoary, her eyes shadowed by sleeplessness or tears, or both, and she moved with a fragility that suggested illness barely held in check. She wore mourning dress of good quality, black silk that rustled as she crossed the room to greet him, and she extended a hand that trembled slightly when he took it. She thanked him for coming, said that she hoped he would witness phenomena that might convince even a skeptic, and confessed that she was both eager for the séance to begin and terrified of what it might reveal. Her husband had been the centre of her existence, she explained. His death had left her purposeless. If the mediums were correct, if communication was possible, then perhaps she might find reason to continue living. And if something more occurred, if the veil opened wide enough to permit passage, then she was prepared to step through rather than endure further years of solitary suffering. Grayson felt an unexpected pang of sympathy for this woman, whose grief had brought her to the edge of rational thought. He wanted to warn her, to tell her that whatever happened during the séance would be the product of human trickery rather than supernatural intervention, that she should not place hope in mediums who exploited sorrow for profit. But he held his tongue, recognizing that such warnings would only alienate her and possibly cause her to cancel the sitting, which would defeat his purpose. Instead, he simply expressed appreciation for her willingness to permit his observation and assured her that he would conduct himself with respect for the proceedings regardless of his personal beliefs. The other participants arrived within the following half hour. De Ashford came first, acknowledged Grayson with a nod that conveyed both greeting and warning, and took a position near the fireplace where he stood in silence. Two friends of Mrs. Sutherland arrived together, both widows of similar age, both dressed in mourning, both exhibiting the drawn expressions of those for whom grief was constant companion. And finally, precisely at 8 o'clock, Madame Devereaux was announced and entered the drawing room like a figure from a darker century, her black dress and veil rendering her simultaneously present and remote, her violet eyes surveying the assembled company with assessment that seemed to penetrate surface appearance and examine something deeper. Her gaze lingered on Grayson for a moment longer than on the others, and he saw recognition in those eyes, acknowledgement that she knew who he was and why he was present. She said nothing, only inclined her head slightly in greeting, and then turned her attention to Mrs. Sutherland, speaking in that accented voice that carried weight beyond its soft volume. She asked if Mrs. Sutherland was certain she wished to proceed, if she understood that séances could sometimes produce phenomena that were disturbing rather than comforting, that the spirits did not always behave as the living hoped. Mrs. Sutherland affirmed her readiness. Madame Devereaux accepted this with grave nod and began directing the preparation of the room. The ritual was now familiar to Grayson from his investigation of the previous disappearances. The gaslights were turned down until only faint glow remained. Heavy curtains were drawn across the windows, blocking the streetlight beyond. Mirrors were covered with dark cloth. The circular table was positioned away from the walls, ensuring that no one could claim hidden apparatus beneath or beside it. Chairs were arranged at equal intervals around the table's circumference. The black velvet cloth was spread smooth, and at the table's centre Madame Devereaux placed 3 candles in ruby glass holders, lighting them with wax taper and speaking words in a language Grayson did not recognise. Not French, not Latin, something older and more guttural. The 6 participants took their seats, Mrs. Sutherland directly opposite Madame Devereaux, to Ashford to the medium's right, Grayson to her left, the 2 widowed friends flanking Mrs. Sutherland. They joined hands as instructed, forming an unbroken circle. Grayson held Madame Devereaux's left hand in his right, finding it cold and dry, the fingers long and strong, the grip firm without being aggressive. On his other side, Mrs. Sutherland's hand was damp with nervous perspiration, trembling in his grasp. He squeezed gently, offering wordless reassurance, and she returned the pressure with desperate gratitude. Madame Devereaux closed her eyes. The room fell silent except for the faint hiss of the gaslights and the settling of coals in the fireplace. Grayson focused his attention on the medium's face, watching for signs of deception, for movements that might indicate she was manipulating apparatus or signalling accomplices. Her breathing slowed, became rhythmic, her chest rising and falling with metronomic regularity. Her head tilted back, exposing the pale column of her throat. Minutes passed. The silence deepened until it seemed to have texture, weight, pressing against eardrums and consciousness alike. The temperature began to drop. Grayson felt it first as a slight cooling of the air against his face, then as a more pronounced chill that penetrated his clothing and erased gooseflesh on his arms. His breath became visible, misting in the candlelight. The others noticed as well. Mrs. Sutherland gasped softly. Dr. Ashford's grip tightened. The two friends exchanged glances of alarm. But Madame Devereaux remained motionless, her face impassive, her eyes closed, apparently unaware of the physical changes occurring in the room. The candle flames began to elongate, stretching upward as though drawn by unseen force, their light dimming despite no reduction in the wax being consumed. The ruby glass holders cast red shadows that moved across the black cloth in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, almost like writing in a script too ancient to decipher. And then, from somewhere that Grayson could not immediately locate, came a sound. It was soft at first, barely audible beneath the blood rushing in his ears, but it grew gradually louder, a tapping, rhythmic and insistent, like fingernails drumming on wood or knuckles rapping on a door. Mrs. Sutherland made a sound of recognition and hope. The tapping continued, establishing a pattern. 3 quick raps, pause, 2 slow raps, pause, repeat. Dr. Ashford spoke into the silence, his voice steady despite obvious tension, asking if a spirit was present, if it wished to communicate. The tapping responded with 3 sharp raps. The code was standard in spiritualist practice. 3 raps for yes, 2 for no, 1 for uncertain. Dr. Ashford asked if the spirit wished to speak with someone specific in the circle. 3 raps. He asked if it was Mrs. Sutherland the spirit sought. 3 raps, louder now, seemingly emanating from directly beneath the head. And then, a voice emerged from the darkness beyond the candlelight. A male voice speaking with accent that suggested education and social standing, addressing Mrs. Sutherland by the pet name that only her husband had used. Margaret, it said. My dearest Margaret. She began to weep, her hands pulling at those of her neighbours, wanting to reach toward the voice but constrained by the instruction to maintain the circle. The voice continued, speaking of love that death could not extinguish, of watching over her from beyond the veil, of the peace that awaited when her time came to join him. It knew details of their private life, referenced conversations and moments that no stranger could have known. And Mrs. Sutherland responded with desperate questions, with pleas for assurance that he was truly present, that this was not cruel deception. Grayson watched Madame Devereaux's face throughout this exchange. Her lips did not move, her throat showed no signs of vocalization, yet the voice clearly came from somewhere near her position at the table. Ventriloquism, he thought, though he had to admit the technique was masterful if that was indeed the explanation. He had attended variety shows where performers threw their voices with skill, but this was more convincing, the sound seeming to emanate from the air itself rather than from any human source. He tightened his grip slightly on the medium's hand, testing for any tension or movement that might indicate she was responsible for the phenomena. He detected nothing unusual. The voice spoke for perhaps 5 minutes, delivering messages of comfort and reassurance that satisfied Mrs. Sutherland's desperate need for contact. And then, as had occurred in the previous séances, the atmosphere shifted. The temperature dropped further still, the cold becoming painful like winter night air in an unheated room. The voice changed, became deeper, less human, speaking words that Grayson did not understand, though they raised the hair on the back of his neck with primitive alarm that preceded rational thought. Mrs. Sutherland's weeping turned to whimpering fear. Dr. Ashford called out that the séance should end, that something was wrong, that Madame Devereaux should break the trance and restore the lights. But Madame Devereaux remained rigid, her face now showing signs of distress, her breathing becoming laboured, her hands gripping those of her neighbours with force that verged on painful. The candles extinguished simultaneously with sound like wind passing through a confined space. Absolute darkness fell. And in that darkness, Grayson experienced something that his rational mind struggled to process, something that would haunt his sleep for years afterward. He felt the presence of something else in the room, not another person, not the other 5 participants whose breathing and movement he could hear, but something additional, something that displaced air and radiated cold and moved with purpose toward the table where they sat. He heard it clearly, footsteps that were not footsteps, more like the sound of something heavy being dragged across floorboards, accompanied by a smell that he recognized from morgues and hospital wards, the sweet sick odor of decay held at bay by chemical treatment but never entirely disguised. He felt it pass behind his chair, felt the air pressure change, felt something brush against his shoulder with touch that was not quite solid, not quite vapor, but something between states of matter. Mrs. Sutherland screamed. The sound was cut off abruptly, not trailing into silence but ending, as though a hand had been clamped over her mouth, or as though she'd been removed from the room with instantaneous speed. Grayson released Madame Devereaux's hand and lunged in the direction where Mrs. Sutherland had been sitting, his hands encountering empty air, then the back of an empty chair. He called for lights, for matches, for someone to restore vision so they could assess the situation. Dr. Ashford was already moving, his footsteps crossing the room toward where the gaslights could be adjusted. A match flared, then another, and the lamps brightened gradually until the room swam back into visibility. 5 people stood around the table. Mrs. Sutherland's chair was empty. The circle had been broken, but this time Grayson had been holding her hand until moments before the darkness fell, and Dr. Ashford had been holding her other hand, and both could testify that she had been physically present until the instant of her scream. The door to the drawing room remained closed. The windows remained latched. The heavy curtains had not been disturbed, and yet the woman had vanished as completely as if she had never existed. Grayson moved immediately to secure the house, calling for the constables he had positioned outside to enter and prevent anyone from leaving the premises. He ordered a search of every room, every closet, every space large enough to conceal a human body. He questioned the servants, establishing that none had entered the first floor during the séance, that all could account for their movements throughout the evening. He examined the drawing room yet again, looking for the mechanism he was certain must exist, the trick that explained how a woman could be removed from a locked room without apparent means of egress. He found nothing. An hour passed, then 2, the search becoming more desperate and yielding fewer results. The 2 widowed friends sat in shocked silence in a side parlour, refusing to leave despite permission to do so. Dr. Ashford remained with them, his physician's training making him attentive to their condition, though his own face showed the strain of having witnessed something that defied medical explanation. And Madame Devereaux sat alone in the drawing room, in the same chair she had occupied during the séance, her violet eyes reflecting the gaslight, her face expressionless, waiting with the patience of one who knows that explanations will not be believed, regardless of how carefully they are delivered. Grayson confronted her as midnight approached, his exhaustion and frustration making him less circumspect than usual. He demanded that she explain how the disappearances were accomplished, what mechanism she and her confederates employed, what purpose these elaborate crimes served. She regarded him with something that might have been pity, or might have been contempt, and she spoke in that accented voice that seemed to carry echoes of older languages, older knowledge. There was no mechanism, she said. There were no confederates. There was only what he had witnessed, the thinning of the veil, the pressing through of forces that should remain on the other side, the claiming of souls who called too loudly and attracted attention from things that were not the beloved dead, but wore their faces and voices like masks. He arrested her. He charged her with conspiracy and kidnapping, though he had no evidence beyond the circumstantial fact of her presence at 2 of the 4 séances. He had her conveyed to Scotland Yard and placed in a cell overnight, intending to interrogate her more thoroughly in the morning, and fatigue would not cloud his judgment. And he returned to his own rooms as dawn broke over London, the December light pale and cheerless, and he sat by his window looking out at the waking city and wondering if perhaps, just perhaps, he had been pursuing the wrong explanation all along, if the impossible might indeed be possible, If the boundary between material and immaterial was less absolute than scientific certainty proclaimed? He did not believe in ghosts. He could not believe in them and remain the man he had made himself become, but he had felt something in that darkened room, had experienced phenomena that resisted rational explanation, and 4 women had vanished without trace despite his vigilance and method. Either he was confronting human deception of extraordinary sophistication, or he was confronting something that his worldview had no framework to accommodate. Neither possibility provided comfort. Both demanded that he continue investigating regardless of where the evidence might lead, even if it led to conclusions that would destroy the certainty on which he had built his life and career. Chapter 8. The Voice in the Dark. Madame Devereaux spent the night in a cell at Scotland Yard, a small stone chamber with a single narrow window set high in the wall and a cot that offered minimal comfort. She did not sleep. Or if she did, the constable who checked on her at hourly intervals never observed it. She sat upright on the cot with her back against the wall, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes open and fixed on some point in the middle distance that suggested she was looking not at the cell's interior but at something beyond it, something visible only to her particular vision. When the constable brought her tea and bread in the morning, she accepted it with a nod, but did not consume either, leaving the cup and plate untouched on the floor beside the cot. Grayson arrived at 8 o'clock. Having slept poorly and briefly in his own rooms, his dreams troubled by images of darkness and cold and hands reaching from places that should contain nothing but empty air. He found Madame Devereaux exactly as the night constable had described, motionless, silent, apparently undisturbed by her incarceration. He had her brought to an interrogation room, a space deliberately austere with a single table and 3 chairs and gaslight that could be adjusted to create either harsh illumination or dim ambience depending on the psychological effect desired. He chose harsh light, wanting to see every detail of her face and every micro-expression that might betray guilt or calculation. She sat across from him with that same unnerving composure, her violet eyes meeting his without flinching or evasion. He began with direct questions. Where were the missing women? What had she done with them? Who were her accomplices? What was the purpose of these elaborate disappearances? She answered none of these questions, only gazed at him with an expression that suggested she was waiting for him to exhaust his predetermined interrogation and arrive at questions he had not planned to ask, questions that might actually lead somewhere useful. After 20 minutes of this fruitless exchange, Grayson changed tactics. He leaned back in his chair and regarded her in silence for a long moment before speaking in a tone that was conversational rather than accusatory. He told her that he did not believe in spirits or supernatural forces, that his entire career had been built on the premise that human behavior, however strange, could be understood through observation and reason. But he admitted that the events of the previous night had troubled him, that he had experienced sensations and phenomena that resisted easy explanation. He asked her, not as inspector interrogating suspect, but as one human being seeking understanding from another, what she believed had actually occurred in that drawing room. For the first time since her arrests, Madame Devereaux's expression changed. Something that might have been relief or recognition passed across her face, and when she spoke, her voice carried less distance, less formality. She told him that belief was not required for certain things to be true, that the world contained forces and entities that existed, regardless of whether modern rationalism acknowledged them, that the Victorian age, with its gaslighting and railways and telegraph wires, had not actually banished the darkness, but only pushed it to the margins where it waited with ancient patience for opportunities to manifest. She told him that séances were dangerous precisely because they were sometimes effective, that the boundary between living and dead was real but permeable, that certain practices and conditions could thin that boundary until things pressed through from the other side. Most mediums were frauds, she admitted freely, theatrical performers who exploited grief for profit. But some, a very few, possessed genuine sensitivity to the forces that moved in the spaces between worlds. She was one such. She had not sought her gift, had not wanted it, had tried for years to suppress it because she understood the dangers involved. But the gift had its own imperatives, its own hunger, and it demanded expression regardless of her will. Grayson listened without interrupting, his detective's instincts analysing her words for inconsistency or calculation. She spoke with conviction that seemed genuine, but conviction proved nothing except that the speaker believed their own narrative. He asked her to explain specifically what had happened to the 4 missing women. She fell silent for a long moment before responding, and when she did, her voice had dropped to near whisper, as though she feared being overheard by something other than human ears. The women had been taken, she said, not by her, not by any living agent, but by something that had learned to use the séance as hunting ground. She called it by a name in that other language she sometimes employed, a word that sounded like wind through dead trees, and then translated approximately as the devourer of grief. It was old, she said, far older than Christianity or any modern religion, old as the first human who had mourned the dead and wished desperately for their return. It fed on that grief, on the psychic energy generated by intense longing and sorrow, and it had learned over centuries to answer when the bereaved called out across the veil to where the faces and voices of the departed, to offer false comfort that drew its victims closer until they could be pulled through into whatever realm it inhabited. Grayson felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the interrogation room. He asked her how she knew this, what evidence supported such extraordinary claims. She said that she had encountered it before, years ago on the continent, that it had claimed victims in Paris and Vienna and Prague, that mediums who recognized what was happening had attempted to warn their communities but had been dismissed as superstitious or mad. She had fled to London hoping that distance might provide protection, but the entity had followed, or perhaps had always been present in London, waiting for someone with sufficient sensitivity to provide it access. And why? Grayson asked with barely controlled anger. Had she continued conducting séances if she knew the danger involved? Why had she not warned her clients? Why had she not refused to practice her supposed gift if it invited such monstrous consequences? Madame Devereaux's composure finally cracked. Tears welled in those violet eyes and spilled down her pale cheeks as she explained in a voice breaking with emotion that she had tried to stop, had tried to warn people, but no one had believed her. And the gift itself had a compulsion built into it, a need that grew stronger with denial, that created pain and illness when she attempted to suppress it. She was as much victim as the women who had disappeared, trapped by abilities she had not chosen and could not fully control. Grayson stood and paced the small room, his mind working through implications and possibilities. If her story was true, if something genuinely supernatural was responsible for the disappearances, then his entire approach to the investigation was futile. He could not arrest a ghost, could not imprison a spirit, could not bring charges against an entity that existed outside physical law. But he did not believe her story, could not allow himself to believe it without abandoning the rational framework that had guided his entire adult life. There had to be another explanation, one rooted in human agency and deception, one that he simply had not yet discovered. He turned back to face her and asked a question that had been forming in his mind since the previous night. If what she claimed was true, if this entity was responsible for the disappearances, then why had it not taken her as well? She was present at the séances. She was the medium through which contact was supposedly established. Surely she would be an obvious target for something that fed on grief and psychic energy. Why was she spared when the others were claimed? Madame Devereaux met his gaze with an expression he could not quite interpret. Fear mixed with something else, something that might have been shame or resignation. She told him that she had made arrangements, had taken precautions that protected her at cost she could not fully articulate. The entity knew her, recognized her as conduit rather than prey, and so long as she continued to provide access to others, it left her unmolested. She was collaborator in the truest sense, enabling the predation she claimed to abhor, and this knowledge had been eating at her conscience for months. She had hoped that by coming to London, by operating in a new city where the entity's presence might be less established, she could somehow break free, but she had been wrong. It had followed, or had always been here. And now 4 more women were lost because of her weakness. Grayson felt a surge of something between pity and disgust. If this was performance, it was masterful, the emotional distress appearing entirely genuine. But if it was truth, if she was admitting to enabling serial abduction or worse, then she bore responsibility regardless of supernatural forces or psychic compulsion. He told her that he would have her remanded for further questioning, that he was not satisfied with her explanations, that evidence would be found and the truth would emerge through proper investigative method. She simply nodded, seeming almost relieved that he refused to believe her, as though his skepticism offered its own form of comfort. He left her in the interrogation room and went to his office, where he found Dr. Marcus Ashford waiting, accompanied by a man Grayson did not recognise. Dr. Ashford introduced his companion as Professor William Hartley, a scholar of ancient religions and occult practices at University College London. The professor was elderly, perhaps 70 years of age, with white hair and beard and eyes that suggested both intelligence and wariness. He had come, Dr. Ashford explained, because he had been consulted about the symbol that had appeared in Miss Corbet's automatic writing before the second disappearance, and his conclusions might be relevant to the investigation. Professor Hartley produced the pages of automatic writing that Grayson had retained as evidence. He pointed to the symbol at the bottom, the circle with intersecting lines forming a cross within its circumference. This was not, he explained, a symbol from any mainstream religious tradition. It appeared in certain very old texts dealing with what medieval scholars had called the commerce between worlds, practices for communicating with or binding entities that existed in realms adjacent to, but separate from material reality. The specific symbol indicated a ward or barrier, a sign meant to repel or constrain something that should not be allowed to cross certain boundaries. The fact that this symbol had appeared as a warning in automatic writing suggested, Professor Hartley continued, that someone or something had been attempting to alert the participants to danger. Whether the source was genuinely a spirit concerned for the living or some part of Miss Corbet's own subconscious mind expressing knowledge she had encountered, but not consciously retained, he could not say with certainty. But the symbol itself was authentic to certain pre-Christian traditions that had dealt with what they called devourers or grief-eaters, entities that were believed to prey upon the mourning and the desperate. Grayson listened with outward patience and inner turmoil. Here was a respected academic, a professor at a prestigious university, speaking with apparent seriousness about entities and realms and practices that belonged to superstition and folklore, not to criminal investigation in the modern age. Yet the professor's account aligned disturbingly well with what Madame Devereaux had told him less than an hour earlier. The coincidence was troubling. Either they were both drawing on the same body of obscure knowledge to construct a convincing shared delusion, or they were both describing something that actually existed. Professor Hartley suggested that if Grayson wished to pursue the investigation in a direction that acknowledged the possibility of supernatural involvement, there were certain experts who might be consulted, certain texts that might be examined, certain rituals that medieval practitioners had used to contain or banish such entities if they became too active in human affairs. Grayson thanked him with strained courtesy and showed both men out, then sat alone in his office staring at the symbol on the page of automatic writing, feeling the foundations of his worldview cracking beneath the weight of accumulating impossibilities. He spent the remainder of the day attempting to pursue more conventional investigative avenues. He sent constables to interview Mrs. P. Sutherland's neighbours, to search the surrounding streets, to make inquiries at railway stations and coaching inns, in case the missing woman had been seen departing London. The results were uniformly negative. He reviewed financial records of all three mediums involved in the séances, looking for evidence of shared accounts or suspicious transactions that might indicate conspiracy. He found nothing irregular. He examined the backgrounds of the missing women again, searching for any connection he might have missed. There was none beyond their widowhood and grief. As evening approached and another December darkness settled over the city, Grayson made a decision that he knew was either courageous or foolhardy depending on perspective. He would attend another séance. He would deliberately create the conditions under which the entity, if it existed, might manifest. And he would confront it, observe it, attempt to understand its nature through direct experience rather than through second-hand accounts and theoretical speculation. If this made him a fool who chased shadows, so be it. If it made him one of the few people in London willing to face facts that defied comfortable categorization, then perhaps foolishness was what the situation demanded. He had Madame Devereaux brought from her cell. He told her his plan, expecting resistance or refusal. Instead, she looked at him with something that might have been respect or might have been pity and agreed immediately. She told him that if he truly wished to witness what she had witnessed, to experience what the missing women had experienced, then she would facilitate that contact. But she warned him that once the veil was torn, once the entity had access, there was no guarantee that it could be controlled or banished. He might become its fifth victim. He might learn truths that would make him wish he had maintained his comfortable skepticism. Grayson accepted these warnings and dismissed them with equal measure. He arranged for a room at Scotland Yard to be prepared according to Madame Devereaux's specifications. Windows covered, mirrors removed, a table with chairs, candles and coloured glass. He summoned de Ashford to serve as witness and physician should medical intervention prove necessary. And as night deepened and the building emptied of clerks and constables going off duty, as silence settled over the stone corridors and gaslit offices, he sat down at that table opposite a woman who claimed to traffic with forces beyond death, and he prepared to offer himself as bait for something that might be entirely imaginary, or might be very real and very hungry. The séance began as the others had begun. Darkness, joined hands, slow breathing, the gradual cooling of air, the descent into silence that seemed to have texture and weight. Grayson kept his eyes open despite instructions to close them, watching Madame Devereaux's face for any sign of conscious manipulation. He saw her enter the trance state, saw her features become mask-like, saw her breathing shift into a pattern that seemed too regular to be voluntarily controlled, and he felt the temperature drop with sudden intensity, felt his breath mist in the candlelight, felt something change in the atmosphere of the room as though a door had opened somewhere that no door should exist. The voice that emerged did not come from Madame Devereaux's throat, though she sat directly across from him. It came from behind him, from the shadows in the corner where no person stood. It spoke his name, Edmund, in a voice he recognized with shock that momentarily paralyzed his ability to respond. It was his daughter's voice, his Sarah who had died of scarlet fever 7 years earlier, at age 6, his Sarah whose death had been the wound that never healed, the grief that had driven him to work obsessively, the loss that had made him the man who trusted evidence over emotion and reason over faith. The voice spoke as she had spoken, with that slight lisp caused by missing front teeth, with that particular rhythm and inflection that he had heard every day of her short life and had carried in memory every day since. It said, "Papa," it said, "I've missed you," it said, "Why did you let me die alone and frightened?" The words were knife blades driven into old scars, opening wounds he had thought scarred over, if not healed. He wanted to turn to see if she was somehow present in the room, to reach for her and hold her, as he had not been able to hold her in her final hours when fever had made her demented and thrashing, and he had been barred from the sick room by the physician, who said his presence would only distress her further. But he did not turn. He gripped the edge of the table and forced himself to think, to analyse, to remember that this was precisely what the entity did according to Madame Devereaux's account. It wore the voices and faces of the dead. It used grief as a weapon and doorway. It was not his daughter. It could not be. She was gone, returned to Earth, or ascended into whatever afterlife existed or simply ended. Consciousness extinguished when her small body could no longer sustain it. This voice was deception, manipulation, bait designed to draw him into the same trap that had claimed 4 women who had loved too desperately and grieved too deeply. He spoke aloud, his voice rough with emotion he struggled to master. He said that he knew this was not his daughter, that his daughter was dead and beyond recall, that whatever spoke with her voice was something else and would not find him so easily deceived. The voice laughed, and the sound was terrible because it was Sarah's laugh, but twisted, made cruel, made mocking. It said that he had always been cold, always put duty before love, always found reasons to be away from home when she needed him. It said that he had failed as a father just as he was failing now as an investigator, pursuing shadows while the truth stood before him in darkness, waiting for acknowledgement. Grayson felt rage kindle beneath the grief, felt anger at this violation of his daughter's memory, at the use of her voice for purposes that defiled everything she had been. He stood abruptly, breaking his contact with Dr. Ashford's hand, and demanded that the séance end, that Madame Devereaux break the trance and restore the lights. But the medium did not respond, remained locked in whatever state allowed the entity access. And the voice continued speaking, moving around the room now, circling him like a predator, assessing prey, speaking truths and lies intermixed, until he could not distinguish one from the other, speaking his failures and his fears and his secret conviction that he was fundamentally alone in a universe that cared nothing for human suffering or hope. And then the voice shifted, dropped its imitation of his daughter and became something else, something that had never been human, speaking in that language Madame Devereaux sometimes employed, that old tongue that raised primitive alarm in parts of his brain that predated civilization. It spoke, and though he did not understand the words, he understood the meaning somehow, felt it impressed directly into his mind without need for linguistic translation. It was hungry. It had been feeding on grief for longer than human cities had existed. It found the modern age particularly rich in sorrow, because people lived in such isolation, surrounded by millions, yet profoundly alone, mourning losses they could not share with communities that no longer existed, desperate for connection that secular materialism denied. The séance room was no longer entirely in Scotland Yard. Grayson could feel this with terrible certainty. Something had shifted when the voice first spoke. Some boundary had thinned or torn, and now he existed simultaneously in the stone building and in somewhere else, somewhere that was cold and dark and filled with whispers of other voices, other losses, other souls who had been drawn through into this place of eternal mourning. He saw shapes in the darkness beyond the candles, forms that suggested human outline but were not quite right, proportions wrong, movements unnatural. And he understood with horror that approached madness that these were the missing women, or what remained of them, trapped in this realm between life and death, sustained by the entities feeding on their grief, kept conscious and aware and suffering for purposes that had nothing to do with malice and everything to do with appetite. He reached for his revolver with hands that shook, knowing the weapon was useless against something that was not physical, not living in any conventional sense, but needing the reassurance of steel and powder as anchor to the material world he understood. The entity laughed with sound like wind through cave markers, and it said that he could not shoot what he could not see, could not kill what had never been alive, could not escape what he had invited through his arrogant insistence on witnessing truth that should remain hidden. It said that it would take him now, that he would join the women in the darkness, that his grief would feed it for years or decades or however long it took to consume every drop of anguish his soul contained. And then Madame Devereaux spoke, her voice cutting through the entity's laughter like light through fog. She spoke in that old language, spoke words that had power beyond their literal meaning, spoke a banishing or binding that Grayson felt as physical force in the room. The entity recoiled, its presence contracting, withdrawing from the space it had begun to occupy. Madame Devereaux continued speaking, her voice growing stronger, her hands moving in gestures that left traces of pale light in the darkness, drawing signs in the air that persisted for heartbeats before fading. The temperature began to rise, the oppressive presence began to diminish, and with a sound like fabric tearing, the connection broke, the boundary sealed itself, and the séance room was only a room again, cold and dim but entirely within Scotland Yard, entirely within the material world, with no whisper of that other realm where grief became eternal and suffering had no end. Grayson found himself on his knees on the floor, no memory of having fallen, his face wet with tears he had not known he was shedding. Dr. Ashford knelt beside him, checking his pulse, speaking words of reassurance that seemed to come from very far away, and Madame Devereaux sat slumped in her chair, exhausted beyond description, her violet eyes now filled with knowledge that Grayson recognised because he shared it. They had both looked into the abyss, had both seen what waited there, and neither would ever be quite the same as they had been before that terrible glimpse into darkness that should remain forever hidden from mortal sight. Chapter 9. The Cellar Beneath. Grayson did not sleep after the séance. He could not. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the shapes that had moved in the darkness, heard the voice that had worn his daughter's memory like a stolen garment, felt the cold that had nothing to do with December weather, and everything to do with proximity to something that should not exist. He sat in his office through the remaining hours of night, drinking coffee that had gone cold and bitter, staring at case files that now seemed almost quaintly inadequate to describe what he had experienced. 4 women had not simply disappeared. They had been taken to a place that existed adjacent to the living world but separate from it, a realm of perpetual twilight where grief became sustenance for an entity that fed on human sorrow. He had been wrong. His rational certainty, his dismissal of supernatural explanation, his conviction that human trickery must account for every mystery, all of it had been wrong. The knowledge sat like lead in his stomach, making him question everything he had believed about the nature of reality, about the limits of the possible, about his own capacity to perceive and understand the world he inhabited. He was a detective, trained to observe and deduce and conclude. But what use was training when the facts themselves defied every principle of material causation he had been taught to trust? As grey dawn broke over London, bringing no warmth or comfort but only dim illumination of the December fog, Dr. Ashford appeared at his office door. The physician looked as haggard as Grayson felt, his face drawn with exhaustion and something deeper, some fundamental disturbance that came from having one's understanding of reality forcibly revised. He entered without invitation and sat in the chair across from Grayson's desk, and for a long moment neither man spoke, both processing in silence what they had witnessed. Finally, Dr. Ashford broke the silence. He said that he had spent his career studying the human body, understanding its mechanics and chemistry, treating illness through material intervention. He had always dismissed spiritualist claims as either delusion or fraud, had assumed that phenomena reported at séances had natural explanations that simply had not yet been discovered. But after what he had experienced in that room, after feeling the presence of something that was not alive in any biological sense, yet was somehow conscious and malevolent, he could no longer maintain his materialist certainty. The question now was what could be done to rescue the missing women, if rescue was even possible, and to prevent the entity from claiming additional victims. Grayson told him about his conversation with Madame Devereaux, about her claim that she had taken precautions that protected her from the entity's predation. If she had knowledge of how to shield oneself, then perhaps she also had knowledge of how to banish or constrain the creature, how to seal the veil it had learned to penetrate. He sent for her, having her brought from the cell where she had been returned after the séance ended. She came with constable escort, still wearing the same black dress, still moving with that eerie composure despite obvious exhaustion. She sat without being invited and regarded both men with expression that contained no surprise, as though she had been expecting this conversation. Grayson asked her directly whether the missing women could be recovered. She was silent for so long that he thought she might refuse to answer, but finally she spoke in voice barely above a whisper. They could be recovered, she said, but the process was dangerous and not guaranteed to succeed. The entity kept its prey in a space that could be accessed through ritual practice, through deliberate tearing of the veil under controlled conditions, but entering that space meant exposing oneself to the entity's full attention, meant walking into its domain where it was strongest and most able to exert influence. Anyone attempting such rescue would likely become trapped themselves, unless they possessed both knowledge of protective practices and strength of will to resist the creature's manipulation. Dr. Ashford asked what would happen to the women if no rescue was attempted. Madame Devereaux's expression darkened. The entity did not kill in conventional sense, she explained. It sustained its victims in state between life and death, feeding on their grief and despair indefinitely. Eventually, after months or years, the victims might be released, returned to the material world as shells of what they had been, alive in technical sense but broken, their minds shattered by a prolonged exposure to the entity's presence, capable only of the most basic functions, forever trapped in the memory of their time in that lightless realm. Some never returned at all, simply faded over time, until they became part of the darkness itself, absorbed entirely into the entity's substance. Grayson felt rage kindle in his chest at this description, rage at the injustice and cruelty of it, rage at his own powerlessness in the face of something that transcended law and human authority. He asked what was required to attempt a rescue, what knowledge and materials were needed. Madame Devereaux listed them methodically, certain herbs and incenses, silver implements inscribed with protective symbols, mirrors of specific composition to reflect and contain psychic energy, and most importantly, the willingness to confront the entity in its own realm and to maintain focus despite whatever it might show or say or threaten. The process would require a séance far more intensive than those she normally conducted, would require her to open the veil wider and hold it open longer, creating pathway large enough for living humans to pass through in both directions. And would she be willing to do this, Grayson asked, knowing that her arrest and imprisonment gave her little incentive to cooperate. She looked at him with those violet eyes and said that she had no choice. She had enabled the entity's predation through her continued practice of mediumship, had provided it access to victims in exchange for her own safety, and the guilt of this collaboration had become unbearable. If there was any possibility of undoing the harm she had facilitated, she would accept whatever risks were involved. She added that even if she wished to refuse, the entity now knew that she had attempted to banish it, had used her knowledge to protect someone from its grasp. It would not forget this betrayal. Her arrangement with it, such as it was, had been broken by her actions during the previous séance. She was no longer protected. If she did not act now to seal the veil permanently, it would eventually claim her as it had claimed the others. The next hours passed in preparation that felt surreal to Grayson despite everything he had witnessed. Madame Devereaux provided detailed instructions, and constables were dispatched across London to gather materials from apothecaries and occult bookshops. Professor Hartley was summoned and consulted regarding certain symbols and ritual procedures described in medieval texts. A location was selected, not Scotland Yard, which felt too exposed to public, but Madame Devereaux's own country house in Hampstead, the property where the summer gathering of mediums had occurred. She explained that the house had been used for séances many times, that the veil there was already thin from repeated practice, that it would require less effort to open a passage wide enough for a rescue attempt. They travelled to Hampstead in the afternoon, Grayson and Ashford, and Madame Devereaux, accompanied by 3 constables whom Grayson trusted to maintain composure in face of phenomena that would test the nerve of even experienced officers. The house looked exactly as it had when Grayson had visited days earlier, shuttered, cold, appearing abandoned. But inside, the rooms had been prepared for spiritualist practice. The largest parlour contained a table of substantial size, chairs arranged in careful circle, and cabinets filled with implements whose purposes Grayson could only partially guess. Madame Devereaux moved through the house with familiarity, opening shutters to admit the grey afternoon light, building fires and grates to combat the winter chill, preparing the space for the ordeal ahead. As evening approached, Grayson explored the grounds while Madame Devereaux and Dr. Ashford arranged materials in the séance room. He found himself drawn to the area behind the conservatory where he had noticed disturbed earth during his previous visit. He approached slowly, some instinct making him cautious, and as he drew near he saw that the rectangular patch of turned soil was larger than he had initially estimated, large enough for several graves rather than one. Frost no longer covered the earth, despite the December cold. The ground appeared almost warm, steam rising from it as though something beneath generated heat. He knelt at the edge of the disturbed area, then on impulse thrust his hand into the loose soil. The earth was warm, almost hot, and as he dug deeper, his fingers encountered something that was neither stone nor root, but something else, something that had texture of fabric or leather, but was warm like living flesh. He jerked his hand back, a sound of revulsion escaping his throat before he could control it. One of the constables came running at the sound, asking if all was well. Grayson did not answer immediately, staring at the soil, at his hand where traces of the earth still clung to his fingers, at the place where something was buried that should not be disturbed. He ordered the constables to excavate carefully, to uncover whatever lay beneath without damaging it. The men worked with shovels and then with bare hands, lifting away layers of soil that remained warm despite the winter air. What they uncovered made even hardened officers of the Metropolitan Police step back in horror and confusion. Buried in the earth were 4 shapes, humanoid in outline but not precisely human, wrapped in what appeared to be cauls or membranes that pulsed with faint rhythmic movement like breathing or heartbeat. Through the translucent material could be seen faces, the faces of the missing women, Mrs. Helmsley and Mrs. Pritchard and Mrs. Blackwood and Mrs. Sutherland, eyes closed, expressions peaceful, looking as though they slept in some terrible cocoon that kept them suspended between life and death. Grayson felt his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The women were here, physically present, buried in the grounds of Madame Devereaux's country house. But this contradicted everything she had told him about the entity keeping its victims in another realm, in space adjacent to material reality. Unless both things were somehow true simultaneously, unless the women existed in 2 places at once, their physical bodies here in the earth, while their consciousness or souls were trapped in that lightless realm he had glimpsed during the séance. The implications were horrifying. The entity was not simply capturing its victims' awareness, but was transforming their actual bodies, wrapping them in some substance that came from or belonged to its own alien nature. He ran back to the house and burst into the séance room where Madame Devereaux was arranging candles and herbs. He demanded explanation, asked why she had not told him the women were buried on her property, asked if this was the proof of her guilt in their disappearances. She turned to face him with an expression of surprise that seemed genuine, and she said that she had not known, that the entity must have done this without her awareness, using her house because it was the location where the veil had been most frequently torn. The bodies were anchors, she explained, physical components of the binding that held the women in the entity's realm. If the bodies were here, then breaking them free might be simpler than she had feared, but it also meant the entity had established much stronger connection to this location than she had realized. The house itself might be functioning as gateway, as permanent thin point in the veil that allowed the creature easier access to the living world. There was no time for further discussion. Sunset was approaching, and Madame Devereaux insisted that the ritual must be performed during the liminal time between day and night, when barriers between worlds were naturally thinnest. Grayson ordered the constables to remain outside, to guard the excavation and to be prepared for anything. He and Dr. Ashford would accompany Madame Devereaux into the séance room, would assist with the ritual as she directed, would attempt to reach the trapped women and bring them back from whatever hell they currently inhabited. The séance room had been transformed during the hours of preparation. The table was covered with black cloth marked with silver symbols that hurt to look at directly, that seemed to twist the eye and create optical illusions of depth where only flat surface existed. Mirrors had been positioned at cardinal points around the circle, angled to reflect and contain energy according to principles Grayson did not understand. Braziers burned with mixture of herbs that produced smoke both sweet and acrid, filling the room with scent that made the mind feel simultaneously sharper and more dreamlike. Candles burned in holders of tarnished silver, their flames casting shadows that moved with unsettling independence from the movements of the living people in the room. Madame Devereaux instructed them to sit, join hands, to focus their intention on the women they sought to rescue. She spoke words in that old language, her voice rising and falling in rhythms that suggested music or poetry from cultures long vanished. The temperature dropped. The candle flames stretched and dimmed. The mirrors began to show reflections that did not match the room's actual contents, hints of corridors that extended into impossible distances, shapes that moved where no shapes should be. faces that pressed against the glass from the other side as though seeking escape or entry. And then the veil tore with sound like thunder contained in a small space, and the séance room was no longer entirely in the house, but also in that other realm, that space of eternal twilight and whispered grief, where the entity waited with hunger that had no end. Grayson felt the transition as physical sensation, like passing through membrane or curtain, and suddenly he could see more clearly the shapes that had been merely suggested in previous encounters. The entity was vast, far larger than he had imagined, its form shifting and uncertain, but definitely present, occupying space in ways that defied three-dimensional geometry, and around it, suspended in darkness like flies in amber, were the 4 women. Conscious and aware and screaming without sound, trapped in private hells constructed from their own memories and griefs. Madame Devereaux spoke with voice that echoed strangely in that space, addressing the entity by name, commanding it to release its captives, threatening it with banishment if it refused. The entity laughed with sound that came from all directions and from within Grayson's own skull, and it said that she had no authority here, that this realm was its domain and had been since before her ancestors learned to speak, that the women were its rightful prey and would not be surrendered. But even as it spoke, Grayson noticed something in its tone, not quite fear but uncertainty, wariness. It respected Madame Devereaux's power, recognized that she posed threat it could not entirely dismiss. She began speaking faster, her words becoming incantation, her free hand drawing symbols in the air that blazed with cold light. The entity recoiled, its vast form contracting, pulling away from the burning signs, and in that moment of distraction the membrane holding the women weakened. Mrs. Helmsley's eyes opened. She saw Grayson, saw Dr. Ashford, saw the possibility of escape. She screamed, not with voice but with mind, and Grayson felt the impact of that scream like physical force, felt her desperation and her rage, and her refusal to remain imprisoned one moment longer. The other women wakened as well, their consciousness returning with rush of awareness that was itself a weapon against their captor. The entity howled, a sound that threatened to shatter thought and sanity, and it lunged toward Madame Devereaux with intention that needed no interpretation. But she continued her incantation, never faltering, never breaking the rhythm that held the gateway open and kept the protective boundaries intact. And Dr. Ashford, acting on instinct or inspiration, pulled a small mirror from his coat, one of the implements Madame Devereaux had insisted he carry, and angled it toward the entity, catching one of the burning symbols and reflecting it back multiplied, intensified. The entity shrieked and withdrew, unable or unwilling to face its own reflected nature. And in that moment the women broke free. They came rushing back through the veil like souls being born rather than rescued. And the séance room suddenly contained 7 people instead of 3. 4 women gasping and sobbing and clutching at anything solid, anything that confirmed they had returned to the material world. Madame Devereaux spoke a final word, a sound that was both beginning and ending, and the veil sealed itself with finality that Grayson felt as pressure in his ears, as sudden absence where terrible presence had been. The rescue was complete. The 4 women were returned, traumatized but alive, their physical bodies no longer wrapped in alien membrane but free and breathing and warm with restored circulation. And the entity was banished, sealed, behind barriers that would require years or decades to erode, given no further opening to exploit. But the cost was visible in Madame Devereaux's face, in the way she slumped forward across the table, in the blood that trickled from her nose and ears, in the violet eyes that no longer focused properly, damaged by whatever forces she had channeled to achieve the banishment. Dr. Ashford immediately began tending to her, checking vital signs, calling for water and blankets. Grayson moved to assist the rescued women, helping them to chairs, speaking words of reassurance that seemed inadequate to the magnitude of what they had endured. And through the windows of the séance room, Through the gathering darkness of December evening came sounds of the constables outside calling questions, asking if all was well, seeking reassurance that whatever they had felt pass through the house had been part of the intended ritual and not a calamity. Grayson called back that all was well, that the women were recovered, that the danger had passed, but he knew, even as he spoke, that this was not entirely true, that something had changed in the house and in himself, and in everyone who had participated in the ritual, that they had looked beyond the veil and would carry that knowledge forward into whatever remained of their lives, and that the world would never again seem as solid or as safe as it had before they learned what waited in the spaces between heartbeats, the darkness behind closed eyes, in the realm where grief became eternal and monsters wore the faces of the beloved dead. Chapter 10. The Unmasking. The aftermath of the rescue unfolded in chambers far removed from séance rooms and supernatural confrontations. Scotland Yard became the site of formal proceedings, of statements taken and reports filed, of attempts to reduce inexplicable events to language that could be processed through official channels. Grayson sat at his desk in the cold light of morning 3 days after the ritual at Hampstead, and struggled to write an account that would satisfy his superiors while remaining truthful to what had actually occurred. The task proved impossible. Every sentence he composed sounded either fantastical or deliberately evasive, and he eventually settled for a report that emphasized the factual recovery of 4 missing women while remaining vague about the precise mechanism of their rescue. The women themselves were recovering in hospital, under care of physicians who treated them for exposure and malnutrition and shock, but who could not address the deeper trauma of what they had experienced. Mrs. Helmsley had not spoken since being brought back, only sat in her bed and stared at the wall with eyes that suggested she was still seeing the darkness from which she had been pulled. Mrs. Pritchard had wept constantly, an involuntary response that no sedative could entirely suppress. Mrs. Blackwood screamed at intervals, sudden eruptions of terror that required restraints to prevent her injuring herself. Only Mrs. Sutherland showed signs of eventual recovery, speaking in broken phrases about the cold and the voices and the sensation of being watched by something vast and hungry, but able at least to acknowledge that she had returned to the material world and that the ordeal was ended. Madame Devereaux remained at her lodgings in Welbeck Street, under medical observation but not under arrest. Grayson had recommended that all charges be dropped, citing her essential cooperation in recovering the victims and acknowledging that conventional law was inadequate to address the peculiar circumstances of the case. His superiors at Scotland Yard had agreed with relief, grateful to close the matter without the publicity that would attend a trial. The spiritualist community regarded Madame Devereaux with a mixture of awe and fear, recognizing that she had done something extraordinary but not entirely understanding what it had cost her. Her violet eyes had lost some of their unsettling intensity, and she moved now with the careful deliberation of one who had been injured in ways not visible to ordinary examination. Grayson visited her 4 days after the ritual, finding her seated in the same chair by the same window where he had first interrogated her. She acknowledged his entrance with slight nod, but did not rise or offer greeting. He sat without invitation and regarded her in silence for a long moment before speaking. He thanked her for her assistance, acknowledged that without her knowledge and willingness to risk herself, the women would have remained trapped indefinitely. She accepted his words without visible emotion, only gazed out of the window at the winter street below. He asked her what would happen now, whether the entity was truly banished or merely repelled temporarily. She was slow to answer, and when she did, her voice lacked the conviction she had displayed before the ritual. The veil was sealed, she said, as completely as her knowledge allowed. But such seals were never permanent. They could be eroded by time, by ignorance, by those who practice mediumship without understanding the dangers involved. The entity was ancient and patient. It would wait in its realm of twilight and grief, would press against the barriers until they weakened, would eventually find another opening to exploit. Perhaps not in London, perhaps not in England, but somewhere grief called loudly enough to be heard across the divide, it would answer and claim new victims. Could it be destroyed rather than merely banished, Grayson asked. Madame Devereaux shook her head slowly. It was not a creature that could be killed in any conventional sense. It was more like a force, an aspect of reality itself, the dark counterpart to love and connection. Where humans mourned, it would always exist in some form, feeding on that sorrow, offering false comfort that drew the desperate closer to dissolution. The best that could be achieved was to recognize it for what it was, to educate those who trafficked with spirits about the dangers involved, to ensure that séances were conducted with proper protections and understanding rather than theatrical ignorance. She told him that she would be leaving London, returning to the continent where certain old families said to still maintain knowledge of these matters, where the veil was watched by those trained to recognize when it grew too thin. She could no longer practice as medium, not after what had occurred, not after feeling the entity's full attention focused upon her during those final moments of the ritual. She had torn something inside herself to achieve the banishment, had burned through reserves of strength that would not regenerate. She would live, but diminished, no longer possessing the gift that had defined her adult life. She spoke of this without obvious regret, as though grateful to be free of a burden she had never wanted. Grayson left her rooms, feeling the weight of questions that would never be fully answered. Had there truly been a supernatural entity, or had Madame Devereaux orchestrated everything through means he still failed to comprehend? He could not dismiss what he himself had experienced, the voice that had spoken with his daughter's inflection, the presence that had moved through sealed rooms, the realm of darkness he had witnessed when the veil was torn. But neither could he fully accept these experiences as proof of the supernatural. Perhaps trauma and fear had produced hallucinations, shared delusions born of expectation and atmosphere. Perhaps the women had been drugged and hidden away, then revealed in dramatic fashion to cement belief in powers that were entirely fraudulent. Yet the evidence contradicted such skeptical explanations. 4 women had disappeared from locked rooms under observation. Those same women had been recovered from burial in earth that should have killed them through suffocation, yet they lived despite days of entombment. The membrane that had wrapped them had been real enough, analysed by physicians who could not identify its composition or origin. And his own experience during the séance, the sensations and visions that had assaulted him, possessed a quality of objective reality that mere hallucination could not account for. He returned to Scotland Yard and found on his desk a report from the constables who had been posted to watch Madame Devereaux's Hampstead property. The house had burned 3 nights previous, consumed by fire of such intensity that nothing remained but foundation stones and ash. The fire brigade had responded, but had been unable to save the structure, and the blaze had been attributed to unbanked coals in one of the fireplaces. The burned earth where the women had been buried showed no trace of the membrane or coals, only scorched soil that had been scattered by the heat. It was as though the house and all evidence it contained had been erased, leaving only memory and testimony that could not be verified through physical evidence. Grayson understood that this was deliberate, that someone had ensured no trace remained of what had occurred there, that the supernatural elements of the case would remain forever unprovable to those who had not witnessed them directly. Whether Madame Devereaux had arranged the fire, or whether it had been the work of others in the spiritualist community who wished to protect their practices from scrutiny, he could not determine. The effect was the same. The case would be closed, the women recovered, the official record sanitized of anything that might invite mockery or investigation. Dr. Marcus Ashford published a paper in the Journal of the Society for Psychical Research, a careful account of the séances and phenomena he had witnessed, stopping short of claiming definitive proof of supernatural forces, but arguing strongly that certain events defied conventional explanation and warranted serious scientific investigation. The paper was received with mixture of interest and derision, cited by believers as validation, and dismissed by skeptics as the product of suggestion and faulty observation. Dr. Ashford's medical practice suffered somewhat from the association with spiritualist matters, but he maintained his conviction that something genuine had occurred, that the boundary between material and immaterial was more permeable than orthodox science acknowledged. The 4 recovered women faced different fates. Mrs. Helmsley never recovered her speech, spent her remaining years in the care of her sister, passing away quietly in her sleep 3 years after the events of December 1873. Mrs. Pritchard recovered sufficiently to resume limited social function, but never attended another séance, never spoke of what she had experienced in the darkness, died of influenza in 1807, still wearing mourning for the husband she had sought to reach beyond the grave. Mrs. Blackwood's family committed her to a private asylum where she lived under sedation until her death in 1880, her mind never recovering from the trauma of captivity in that realm where grief became eternal. Only Mrs. Sutherland achieved something resembling recovery, remarried 2 years later to a widower who accepted her past without demanding explanation, lived until 1902 and died surrounded by children and grandchildren who knew nothing of the darkness she had survived. The mediums whose séances had produced the disappearances faced varied consequences. Miss Sarah Corbett abandoned spiritualism entirely, took a position as governess, and lived quietly until her death in 1889, never speaking publicly about the events that had ended her practice. Mr. Joshua Kent continued conducting séances, but was exposed as fraud by investigators in 1875, his physical manifestations proven to be theatrical trickery, his reputation destroyed by scandal that made no mention of the one time something genuinely inexplicable had occurred at his sitting. And Madame Estella Devereaux vanished from London as she had promised. No record of her movements after December 1873, her lodgings in Welbeck Street taken by another tenant, her name appearing occasionally in continental newspapers associated with mystical circles, but never again with séances or spirit communication. Grayson himself was promoted to Chief Inspector in 1875, continued his career with distinction, retired in 1890 with commendations and pension. He married late, at age 45, to a widow who possessed enough independent fortune to overlook his middle-class origins and enough sense not to ask her about the case that had changed him, that had left him prone to nightmares and to standing at windows in the small hours staring at darkness as though expecting something to emerge from it. He never attended another séance, never consulted mediums, never sought communication with the dead, though he thought often of his daughter Sarah, and wondered if what he had heard in that séance room had been genuinely her voice, or only the entity wearing her memory like a stolen garment. He kept the case files in a locked drawer in his study, documents he reviewed on occasion when sleep would not come and memories demanded attention. The pages recorded facts but could not capture the terror and confusion of those December days, the sensation of reality cracking to reveal something underneath that should have remained hidden. The knowledge that the world was larger and stranger and more dangerous than comfortable Victorian certainty acknowledged. He had been a man who trusted evidence and reason, who believed that human behaviour could be understood through observation and analysis. He died still believing these things, but with the uncomfortable awareness that evidence and reason had limits, that some phenomena lay beyond their reach, and that the spaces between what was known and what could be known were inhabited by things that were neither human nor concerned with human flourishing. The winter of 1873 passed into memory. London continued its endless expansion, swallowing countryside and villages, spreading in its brick and iron and gaslight across the Thames Valley. The fog still rose from the river on the cold evenings, still turned the city into a place of shadows and uncertain vision. And in drawing rooms across the capital, séances continued to be held, circles continued to form around tables draped in black cloth, candles continued to flicker in darkened rooms where the grieving called out to the dead and hoped desperately for answers. Most of these séances produced nothing but theatre and disappointed hope. Most mediums were frauds or self-deluded, using tricks and cold reading to create the illusion of contact with the departed. But occasionally, very rarely, something genuine would respond when the living called across the veil. Sometimes it was benign, a fragment of consciousness that had somehow persisted beyond bodily death, offering comfort or closure or simply acknowledgement that love survived the grave. And sometimes it was not benign at all, but something ancient and hungry that wore beloved faiths and spoke with cherished voices. drawing the desperate closer to boundaries that should not be crossed, feeding on grief that was infinite and inexhaustible, waiting with patience that outlasted empires and epochs for the next moment, when the veil would tear and prey would present itself wrapped in sorrow and ready to be claimed. The Séance Killer, as the newspapers had briefly called the phenomena, was never officially identified or apprehended. The case remained technically open in Scotland Yard files, listed as solved through recovery of victims but unsolved regarding the identity and fate of the perpetrator. No one was charged, no one stood trial, no one was punished according to English law. Because how could law address something that existed in spaces between worlds? Something that could not be handcuffed or imprisoned or hanged? Something that was neither living nor dead but older than both states? As eternal as grief itself and as patient as the darkness that waits for every candle eventually to gutter and go out. And so the story ended not with justice but with survival, not with answers but with warnings unheeded by those who came after. Not with closure, but with the uncomfortable knowledge that some doors, once open, could never be entirely closed again, and that the darkness beyond those doors was full of whispers and promises and hungers that would wait forever, for the next desperate soul to call out seeking comfort from the dead, never suspecting that what answered might be something that had never been human, and had no interest in human happiness. Only in the endless feast that grief provided to those patient enough to wait and cruel enough to deceive. The winter deepened. The fog thickened. The gaslights burned low in windows across London. And in the spaces between heartbeats, in the silence after prayers, in the darkness behind closed eyes, something ancient stirred and settled and waited, knowing that grief was eternal, and that the living would always call to the dead, and that when they called loudly enough, desperately enough, it would always be there to answer.